After my father passed away, my younger sister inherited $36 million and our family estate. The very same night, she threw my bags into the pouring rain and told me to get off her property. A few days later, our family lawyer laughed and asked her, "Did you actually read the will?" She went completely pale when she realized what it really said. My name is Sloane, and I am 33 years old. I work as a forensic accountant, which means I make a living uncovering the money that corrupt people try to hide. When my family kicked me out, I did not scream or beg. I just smiled, knowing exactly what financial ruin awaited them. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who thought they could walk all over you. The freezing rain was coming down in thick, heavy sheets, soaking right through my dark wool coat and chilling me to the bone. I stood on the meticulously manicured lawn of the estate I had called home for my entire life. The massive front doors of the mansion were wide open, spilling warm, golden light out into the dark and stormy night. That warmth was no longer meant for me. A heavy designer suitcase came flying out the door, landing with a sickening thud in a muddy puddle right at my feet. It was followed seconds later by a smaller carry-on bag, which bounced off the stone pathway and scraped against the wet grass. The zipper burst open, spilling my plain work blouses and folders out into the mud. "And take your cheap clothes with you," Madison yelled, her voice echoing loudly over the sound of the pouring rain. My younger sister stood under the grand portico, completely dry and perfectly styled. She was 30 years old, but acting like a spoiled teenager who had just stolen a toy. She was wearing a luxurious cashmere sweater and holding a delicate glass of expensive champagne, looking down at me as if I were a stranger trespassing on her property. "This house is mine now, Sloane," she announced, taking a triumphant sip of her drink. "The estate, the cars, the entire Harrison Group. $36 million, all mine." Dad finally realized who the true face of this family is. "You are nothing but a boring number cruncher. So get off my property before I have security throw you out." I did not say a single word. I just looked at her standing there in her arrogant glory. Behind her, a tall and handsome man stepped out into the light. It was her husband, Donovan. He was a slick, fast-talking investment director who always wore custom-tailored suits and a condescending smile. He leaned casually against the heavy oak doorframe, tossing a set of car keys in the air and catching them with one hand. I recognized the silver keychain immediately. They were the keys to my father's vintage Porsche, the car he had cherished more than anything. "Tough break," Sloane Donovan said, his deep voice dripping with fake sympathy. He chuckled, twirling the Porsche keys around his finger. "You spent all those years studying to be a forensic accountant, digging into other people's finances, but you could not even secure your own inheritance. What is the point of being so smart if you end up with absolutely nothing? Madison and I have a $36 million empire to run now. We cannot have you hanging around dragging down our vibe with your depressing energy." He stepped up behind my sister, wrapping an arm around her waist and kissing her cheek. They looked like a couple out of a luxury magazine advertisement celebrating their newfound absolute power. "Maybe if you work really hard," Donovan sneered, "we will hire you to audit our petty cash account next year. You know, just to keep you off the streets." Madison laughed loudly at his cruel joke. The sound cut through the heavy rain, sharp and venomous. I slowly bent down and picked up my ruined blouses, placing them back into the broken suitcase. My hands were freezing, covered in mud and ice-cold water, but my heart was completely steady. I was not crying, I was not begging, I just felt a profound, chilling clarity. Footsteps echoed on the marble foyer inside, and another figure emerged from the warm glow of the house. It was my mother, Catherine. She was 58 years old, a woman obsessed with country club status and social appearances. I looked up at her, hoping for a brief second that some maternal instinct might override her greed. I hoped she might tell Madison to stop, to let me stay just for the night until the brutal storm passed. Instead, she looked at me with an expression of pure exhaustion and annoyance, as if my standing in the rain was a personal inconvenience to her evening. She walked carefully to the edge of the covered porch, making sure to avoid the splashing rain, and reached into the pocket of her trousers. She pulled out a single piece of paper, crumpled it into a ball, and tossed it toward me. It fluttered in the wind before landing directly on my wet suitcase. It was a $100 bill. "Take it and call an Uber," my mother said, her voice completely devoid of emotion. "You are 33 years old, Sloan. It is time you stop relying on us. Madison and Donovan need space and peace of mind to take over the corporation. The board of directors is watching them closely, and you are just a distraction. Take your things and leave. Do not make this family look any worse than you already have." She turned her back on me without a second glance, walking back into the warmth of the mansion. Madison gave me one last victorious smirk before pulling Donovan inside. The heavy wooden doors slammed shut with a resounding thud, followed by the distinct click of the deadbolt locking into place. I was entirely alone in the dark. I stood in the freezing rain for a long moment. I reached down and picked up the crumpled $100 bill. It was damp and covered in dirt. Anyone else might have fallen to their knees and wept at the sheer cruelty of their own mother and sister, tossing them out like garbage just days after their father died. But I did not shed a single tear. I smoothed out the $100 bill and folded it carefully into my coat pocket. I was going to keep this exact bill. I was going to keep it so I could hand it right back to my mother when she eventually came crawling to me for survival. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, shielding the bright screen from the rain. It was a text message from Mitchell, our family lawyer, the only other person on earth who knew the absolute truth about my father's final days. The message was short and precise. The rats took the bait. Initiate phase 1. A cold, genuine smile spread across my face. I grabbed the handles of my heavy, mud-soaked suitcases and began walking down the long driveway toward the street to wait for a taxi. They thought they had won. They thought they had secured a $36 million fortune and kicked the useless sister to the curb. Madison Donovan and my mother had no idea that the empire they were celebrating was nothing but a beautiful hollow shell. And they had absolutely no idea that I held the match that was going to burn their entire lives to the ground. 24 hours before the freezing rain soaked my clothes and my sister threw me out like trash, the air inside Mitchell's downtown law office was thick with a suffocating tension. The mahogany-paneled walls and high-backed leather chairs usually commanded respect, but today they just felt like a velvet-lined boxing ring. My father had been dead for exactly 2 weeks. We were gathered around a massive polished oak conference table for the official reading of his last will and testament. My mother, Catherine, sat at the head of the table next to Mitchell. She wore a tailored black designer dress that probably cost more than my first car, dabbing at perfectly dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. Madison sat directly across from me, her leg bouncing anxiously under the table. She kept checking her reflection in her phone screen, making sure her glamorous morning makeup remained flawless. Beside her sat Donovan, leaning back with his arms crossed over his broad chest. His dark skin contrasted sharply with the crisp white collar of his custom Italian suit. He looked less like a grieving son-in-law and more like a corporate shark waiting for a bleeding fish to drop into the water. I sat quietly at the far end of the table. I wore my standard gray business suit, my hair pulled back into a tight bun. As a forensic accountant, I was trained to observe microscopic details to read the numbers hidden beneath the surface of any lie. But today I was reading the people. I watched the greedy anticipation practically radiating from Madison and Donovan. They were practically salivating at the prospect of wealth. Mitchell cleared his throat, adjusting his gold-rimmed reading glasses. He was an older man, a lifelong confidant of my father, and a lawyer known for his absolute discretion. He began reading the standard legal preamble, verifying my father's sound mind and body at the time the document was drafted. My mother sighed loudly, a theatrical display of grief, meant to remind everyone of her status as the grieving widow. "Let us get to the important part, Mitchell," my mother interrupted, waving her hand dismissively. We all know Harrison wanted the transition of his business to be seamless. Madison and Donovan have practically been running the Harrison Group for the past year anyway. They need the legal authority to keep the market stable and reassure the investors. Mitchell did not flinch at her rude interruption. He simply turned the thick parchment page. Very well, Catherine. We will proceed to the primary assets. Regarding the Harrison Group and its associated real estate holdings, including the primary family estate. Madison stopped bouncing her leg. Donovan sat up straight, his dark eyes locked onto the folder in Mitchell's hands. I leave 100% of my voting shares equity and controlling interest in the Harrison Group, along with the deed to the family estate to my youngest daughter, Madison. The total estimated valuation of these assets stands at $36 million. A high-pitched shriek erupted from Madison's throat. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated greed. She leapt out of her chair, clapping her hands together like a lottery winner. She threw her arms around Donovan, who let out a loud, booming laugh of triumph. He kissed her deeply, whispering something in her ear that made her squeal again. My mother smiled warmly, reaching over to pat Madison's hand. "You deserve it, darling," Catherine said, her voice dripping with absolute pride. "Your father knew you and Donovan were the only ones capable of carrying on his legacy. You have the right image for the company. You belong in the spotlight." I remained completely still. I did not gasp. I did not protest. I just watched them celebrate dividing up my father's empire before his gravestone was even fully carved. Mitchell waited for their obnoxious celebration to die down. He turned to the final page of the document. He looked directly at me, his face an unreadable mask of professional detachment. To my eldest daughter, Sloane Mitchell, read aloud, his voice steady and clear. "I leave the sum of $1, along with the sole ownership and absolute control of a private entity known as Silverwood LLC." The room fell dead silent for a fraction of a second. Then Madison burst into a fit of cruel, mocking laughter. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at me, unable to contain her vicious amusement. $1? Madison gasped, wiping a tear of laughter from her eye. "He left you a single dollar bill. I cannot believe it. Dad actually cut you out completely." Mitchell reached into his suit pocket, pulled out a crisp, brand-new $1 bill, and slid it across the polished oak table. It stopped right in front of my folded hands. Donovan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and intense disgust. His handsome face twisted into a cruel sneer. "What a massive waste of an education," Sloane Donovan mocked, shaking his head slowly. "Why did you spend all those years studying to be a forensic accountant when your own father did not even bother leaving you any assets to count? You can take that single dollar and go audit a vending machine, maybe buy yourself a cheap cup of coffee on the way to the unemployment office." My mother did not reprimand him for the insult. She simply adjusted her diamond necklace and looked at me with cold indifference. "Your father was a highly practical man, Sloane," Catherine said, her tone icy and dismissive. "He knew you chose a boring, unglamorous path. You never cared about the family image. You never fit into our high society circles. Giving you the company would have been a catastrophic waste of potential. Madison and Donovan know how to project wealth. They know how to attract prestigious investors. You should just accept this and move out of the house quietly. Do not make a scene and embarrass us." I looked down at the crisp $1 bill resting on the table. I slowly reached out and picked it up, folding it neatly in half and sliding it into the breast pocket of my gray suit. "I understand completely," I said, my voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion. "I respect my father's final wishes." Madison rolled her eyes, turning her back to me to celebrate with her husband again. Donovan pulled out his phone, already scrolling through luxury watch catalogs. They were completely blinded by the illusion of their newfound $36 million fortune. They did not even care to ask what Silverwood LLC was. To them it was just a junk name, a worthless shell company meant to add insult to my injury. Mitchell reached down to the floor beside his chair and picked up a thick, heavy black leather folder. It was sealed with a tamper-proof security lock. He placed it on the table and pushed it toward me. This contains all the incorporation documents, banking access codes, and absolute operational authority for Silverwood LLC, Mitchell said formally. As of this exact moment, you are the sole managing director, Sloan. I reached out and placed my hands flat against the cool leather of the folder. When I looked up, I met Mitchell's eyes. For one brief, fleeting microsecond, the professional mask on the old lawyer's face slipped. The corner of his mouth twitched upward by a fraction of a millimeter. His eyes flashed with a sharp, dangerous intelligence. I held his gaze and gave him a single, barely perceptible nod. It was a silent, unbreakable pact. A secret look exchanged right in the middle of a room full of arrogant fools. Madison was busy bragging to her mother about the upcoming yacht club parties she was going to host. Donovan was busy calculating his new status in the investment world. Not a single person in my treacherous family noticed the silent communication passing between the lawyer and the disinherited daughter. They thought they had just won the ultimate victory. They thought my father had discarded me like a broken tool. They had absolutely no idea that inside this black leather folder rested the financial guillotine that was about to sever their greedy heads. That very same evening, my mother decided a massive celebration was in order. We were seated in the private dining room of the most obnoxiously expensive restaurant in the financial district. The walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling vintage wine displays, and the room was illuminated by a cascading crystal chandelier that looked like frozen rain. I was still wearing my plain gray business suit from the lawyer's office, sitting rigidly at the edge of the plush velvet booth. Madison, however, had somehow found the time to go shopping. She was wearing a sparkling emerald gown that screamed new money and reckless spending. Donovan sat right beside her in a crisp silk shirt, his heavy gold cufflinks catching the dim restaurant lighting every time he raised his glass. They ordered like royalty who had just conquered a new kingdom. Catherine summoned the sommelier and requested 3 bottles of their finest imported vintage champagne. Donovan ordered the beluga caviar service, a round of imported truffles, and a dry-aged Wagyu steak that cost more than a standard monthly car payment. He leaned back in his leather chair, swirling his dark wine, and began loudly dictating his grand vision for the Harrison Group. He talked aggressively about restructuring the investment portfolios, laying off the redundant administrative staff to cut costs, and launching a massive marketing campaign to rebrand the entire corporation under his and Madison's image. Madison was practically vibrating with greed and excitement. She spent the entire dinner taking photos of her extravagant food and recording videos for her social media followers. She made sure to angle her phone camera so the luxury restaurant background was perfectly visible, loudly declaring to her audience that she was stepping into her new era as a corporate boss. She did not know the first thing about running a corporation. She could barely balance her own personal checking account without overdrawing it. But in her mind, the $36 million valuation she heard at the lawyer's office meant she had a bottomless pit of cash to fund her vanity. Catherine beamed at the two of them with absolute adoration. She raised her crystal flute, tapping it lightly with a silver spoon, to call for our attention. To my beautiful daughter and my brilliant son-in-law, Catherine announced, her voice echoing off the private room walls. You are going to take your father's legacy to absolute heights. I always knew you two were destined for greatness. The family empire is finally in the right hands. They clinked their glasses together in a loud symphony of greed. I did not raise my water glass. I just watched them gorge themselves on imported seafood and $1,000 wine. As a forensic accountant, my brain was already running the numbers behind their lavish display. I calculated the exact cost of their feast, cross-referencing it with the fraudulent spending habits I had already uncovered in Donovan's hidden bank records. They were celebrating a complete mirage. They were feasting on the luxurious deck of a sinking ship, completely oblivious to the massive hole tearing through the hull. 2 hours later, the obsequious head waiter approached our table. He carried a sleek black leather folio holding the final bill. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, looking at Donovan, expecting the loudest man at the table to pay. But before the waiter could even set it down, Catherine reached out her manicured hand and snatched the leather folder. She flipped it open, her eyes briefly scanning the itemized receipt. The total was staggering. Exactly $8,420. Instead of handing it to Donovan or offering to pay it herself from the generous allowance my father had left her, Catherine snapped the folder shut and slid it directly across the white linen tablecloth. It stopped right in front of my half-empty water glass. "Sloane, you are paying for dinner tonight," Catherine stated. It was not a request. It was a cold command disguised as a family expectation. I looked up from the black leather folder and met my mother's gaze. "You invited me to a celebration dinner for Madison," I said, my voice perfectly level. "You ordered the vintage champagne. I had a side salad and tap water." Catherine let out a sharp, irritated sigh, rolling her eyes, as if I were a misbehaving child. "Do not be so petty, Sloane. Madison is about to take over the entire Harrison Group. She has massive responsibilities resting on her shoulders now. She and Donovan have to manage $36 million in corporate assets. You are the older sister. You received a free meal at a fine dining establishment. You need to know your place and show some gratitude. Covering this dinner is the absolute least you can do to support your sister's new journey." Madison giggled behind her cloth napkin, leaning her head onto Donovan's shoulder. "Come on, Sloane," Madison teased maliciously. "You have a steady job auditing boring spreadsheets all day. You can afford to treat your favorite sister. Think of it as a congratulatory gift for my new promotion. Or maybe you are just bitter because Dad gave me the empire and left you with that stupid $1 bill." Donovan chuckled, crossing his arms and watching me with that familiar condescending smirk. "Let the accountant pay," Catherine, Donovan said smoothly. "It makes her feel useful. She cannot build wealth, so she might as well spend her little salary serving the people who actually run the business world." I did not argue. I did not point out the sheer absurdity of a self-proclaimed multimillionaire demanding her disinherited sister pay an $8,000 dinner tab. Arguing with them was entirely pointless. They thrived on making me feel small. They needed me to look defeated to fuel their own inflated egos. I calmly opened my gray leather handbag. I bypassed my personal debit card. I ignored my standard bank credit card. Instead, I reached into the hidden zipper compartment and pulled out a heavy, solid metal credit card. It was matte black with sharp silver edging, completely devoid of any flashy bank logos. It was elegant, heavy, and undeniably exclusive. I placed the heavy metal card onto the leather folio. The head waiter picked it up immediately, bowing his head before rushing over to the mobile point-of-sale terminal resting on a nearby serving cart. Catherine turned her attention back to Madison to discuss their upcoming shopping trip in Paris. They completely ignored me, assuming I had just drained my entire personal savings account to satisfy their ego trip. A few seconds later, the point-of-sale machine beeped a pleasant, confirming tone. The transaction was approved instantly. No hesitation, no fraud alert, just a seamless $8,000 charge processed in the blink of an eye. The waiter returned, handing me the receipt to sign, along with the heavy matte black card. I took the sleek silver pen he offered and signed my name with smooth, fluid strokes. As I placed the card back into my handbag, Donovan suddenly leaned forward across the table. The condescending smirk had completely vanished from his face. His dark eyes narrowed into sharp, calculating slits. As a man who obsessed over wealth and corporate status symbols, he recognized exactly what he had just seen. The card I used was not a standard consumer credit line. The sleek metal design, the specific arrangement of the embossed silver lettering, it was a Tier 1 corporate platinum account. And right below my name, etched perfectly into the heavy black metal, were the bold words, Silverwood LLC. Donovan stared intently at my handbag, his jaw tightening. He was a scammer, a man who lived and breathed financial deception, and his instincts were suddenly screaming at him. He realized in that exact moment that a useless shell company left to a disinherited daughter should absolutely not possess an unrestricted platinum corporate credit line capable of instantly clearing an $8,000 charge without a single red flag. I zipped my handbag shut, looking directly into Donovan's eyes. I gave him a slow, chilling smile, watching the very first seed of absolute terror plant itself deep inside his arrogant mind. The ride to the hotel was silent. The city lights smeared against the rain-streaked window of the taxi, casting long shadows across the back seat. I instructed the driver to drop me off at the Sovereign, a discreet high-security hotel favored by corporate executives who valued absolute privacy and discretion. I walked through the gilded lobby, completely ignoring the concerned glances of the concierge who noticed my soaked gray suit and mud-stained shoes. My posture was perfectly straight. My mind was entirely focused. Inside the penthouse suite, I locked the heavy mahogany door and immediately engaged the deadbolt. The silence of the soundproof room was immediate and absolute, a stark contrast to the screaming and the storm I had just left behind at the family estate. I walked over to the pristine white duvet of the king-size bed and lifted the heavy designer suitcase onto the mattress. Madison thought she had humiliated me by throwing this bag into the freezing mud. She thought it contained my pathetic, cheap wardrobe. She was spectacularly wrong. I unzipped the main compartment and pushed aside a thin, superficial layer of damp blouses and ordinary sweaters. Underneath lay the true contents of my luggage. Stacks of thick black binders, encrypted hard drives, and thousands of pages of highly confidential bank statements filled the entire case. This was the actual lifeblood of the Harrison Group. I stripped off my ruined wet coat, poured myself a glass of sparkling water from the minibar, and began spreading the documents across the massive bed. The spreadsheets were a complex, chaotic web of numbers to an untrained eye, but to me, they were a beautifully tragic story waiting to be read. 6 months ago, the narrative of our perfect, wealthy family had begun to crack behind closed doors. My father had summoned me to his private study late one evening. He looked entirely defeated, his skin pale and his hands shaking slightly. The powerful, commanding chairman of the board had been replaced by an old man suffocating under the weight of his own suspicions. He told me the company was bleeding cash at an alarming rate, and he could not pinpoint the source. He could not trust his board of directors. He certainly could not trust my mother, Catherine, who only cared about her social standing and her next country club event. And he had finally realized he could not trust his golden child, Madison, or her slick, fast-talking husband. He hired me. He did not hire me as his estranged daughter, but as the ruthless, cold-blooded forensic accountant he knew I was. He gave me unrestricted shadow access to every single ledger, every hidden account, and every corporate expense report. I spent half a year working entirely in the shadows, analyzing data late into the night, tracing every single dime that flowed in and out of his empire. Now tracing my index finger over the highlighted columns on the hotel bed, I admired the sheer audacity of Donovan's deception. Donovan was a smooth talker, a man who blinded the aging board members with aggressive growth projections and flashy financial presentations. But numbers do not lie. Numbers do not care about custom Italian suits or charming, arrogant smiles. I pulled out the master ledger for the third quarter and opened my laptop to cross-reference the data. Donovan had utilized his position as investment director to set up a labyrinth of dummy corporations registered in notorious tax havens. He authorized massive corporate loans from the Harrison Group under the guise of aggressive commercial real estate acquisitions. But there were no acquisitions. There were no new developments or shopping centers. The properties listed in his official reports were either barren plots of worthless land or entirely fictitious addresses fabricated out of thin air. He had been systematically bleeding the Harrison Group dry. I connected my encrypted hard drive and pulled up the outbound wire transfers I had legally subpoenaed through my shadow investigation. The picture was brutally clear, painting a portrait of a man completely out of control. Donovan had not just skimmed a little off the top to fund his luxury lifestyle. He had siphoned over $10 million directly from the company's operational reserves. I tracked the complex routing numbers across 3 different continents. Millions of dollars had been dumped into high-stakes, unregulated offshore gambling syndicates. Donovan was a degenerate gambler hiding behind a respectable corporate title. He chased massive losses at virtual poker tables and illegal sports betting rings, stealing even more corporate funds to try and win back the deficit before the annual audits caught up to him. He was digging a grave and trying to fill it with stolen gold, and the rest of the stolen money went directly to Madison. Donovan had funneled millions into a series of shell accounts that paid for her extravagant influencer lifestyle. The designer emerald gowns, the first-class flights to Paris, the constant renovations to the estate, and the $2 million yacht she had been eyeing. It was all financed by the systematic destruction of my father's life work. She was parading around as a self-made boss, completely oblivious to the fact that her husband was a desperate criminal, funding her vanity with stolen cash. I picked up the final valuation report, the very same thick document that had caused Madison to squeal with delight in the lawyer's office earlier that day. The document proudly stated the Harrison Group was worth $36 million. It was a complete and utter ghost. It was a fabricated valuation built on doctored revenue streams and deliberately hidden liabilities. The so-called $36 million empire was actually suffocating under a massive mountain of toxic debt. Because of Donovan's reckless embezzlement and Madison's unchecked narcissistic greed, the corporation was completely insolvent. They thought they had just inherited the world and kicked me to the curb. They did not realize they were currently standing on a fragile trapdoor, mere inches from a catastrophic, inescapable bankruptcy. And I was the only person holding the lever. I reached into the inner pocket of my leather bag and pulled out a small, encrypted titanium flash drive. Mitchell had slipped it to me weeks ago, right before my father was moved to hospice care. I plugged it into my laptop and typed in the 32-character alphanumeric passcode my father and I had memorized. The screen went black for a fraction of a second before a high-definition video file appeared on the monitor. I clicked play. My father, Harrison, sat behind his massive oak desk in his home office. He looked incredibly frail. The aggressive cancer had hollowed out his cheeks and stripped away his physical strength, but his eyes burned with that familiar, terrifying corporate sharpness. He looked directly into the camera lens, and for a moment it felt like he was sitting right there in the hotel room with me. "Sloan," my father said, his voice raspy but entirely steady. "If you are watching this, it means I am dead. It also means Mitchell executed the public will exactly as we planned, and your mother and sister have officially kicked you out. I know it hurts. I know it is a cruel thing to put you through. But you are the only one in this family with the spine to handle the truth, and the only one with the intellect to execute this final transaction." I leaned closer to the screen, my eyes locked onto his face. I did not blink. "When you brought me the forensic audit 6 months ago," my father continued, coughing slightly before taking a sip of water. "When you proved that Donovan was embezzling millions to fund his gambling addiction and that Madison was burning through our operational capital to play dress-up for her internet followers, it broke my heart. But more than that, it offended my business sense. I built the Harrison Group from the ground up. I was not going to let a slick, thieving son-in-law and an entitled, arrogant daughter destroy my life's work. But I could not just fire Donovan. He had deeply entangled the corporate accounts with illegal offshore gambling syndicates. If I fired him and called the authorities, the ensuing scandal and federal investigations would have completely dismantled the company and dragged our family name through the mud for a decade. My father leaned forward, interlacing his thin fingers. I saw the genius calculating predator awaken in his dying eyes. "So I decided to play their game," he stated coldly. "I let Donovan think he was outsmarting an old dying man. I let Catherine and Madison believe they were securing their grand high society future. But you and I know the golden rule of accounting, Sloan. You cannot hide the money from the person who owns the bank. That is why we created Silverwood LLC. I nodded slowly to the empty room, remembering the late nights spent drafting the corporate structuring documents in absolute secrecy. Over the last 6 months, my father explained I utilized my supreme executive authority to quietly restructure our entire holding portfolio. We stripped the Harrison Group down to its bare studs. We funneled every single dollar of clean, untainted cash directly into Silverwood LLC through highly complex, perfectly legal vendor contracts. We transferred the ownership of every valuable patent, every proprietary software license, and the legal trademark of the Harrison Group name itself into Silverwood. He paused, letting the magnitude of his financial maneuvering sink in. And we did not stop there, my father said, a sharp, vindictive smile crossing his pale face. The physical real estate, the corporate headquarters downtown, the regional manufacturing plants, even the multi-million-dollar family estate where your mother and sister are currently sleeping. I transferred the physical deeds of the land to Silverwood LLC. The Harrison Group no longer owns the ground it stands on. They are merely renting it from you. I opened the black leather folder Mitchell had slid across the conference table. My eyes traced the meticulous legal transferring agreements. The brilliance of the trap was breathtaking. My father had weaponized Donovan's own greed against him. Every time Donovan falsified a growth report to justify taking on more corporate debt, my father had quietly approved it, knowing that Silverwood LLC was the silent entity purchasing that exact debt on the secondary market. Donovan had literally dug his own financial grave, and my father had gladly handed him the shovel. I laid the promissory notes out on the king-sized bed next to the offshore bank statements. The Harrison Group was contractually obligated to make a massive ballooning debt payment by the end of the fiscal quarter. Without the clean cash reserves that we had already siphoned away into Silverwood, there was absolutely no way Donovan could cover the payment. If he missed it by even a single day, Silverwood LLC had the legal right to instantly call in the entire $40 million loan, seize all remaining assets, and force the Harrison Group into immediate catastrophic liquidation. Donovan thinks he is a mastermind. My father continued, his tone dripping with absolute contempt. He saw the $36 million valuation on paper, and his greedy eyes went blind to the liabilities. He does not realize that to keep his offshore gambling debts hidden, he forced the Harrison Group to take on massive amounts of emergency commercial debt. And who stepped in to quietly purchase that debt through anonymous third-party brokers, who bought up every single loan, every mortgage, and every line of credit the Harrison Group relies on to survive. Silverwood, LLC. I whispered to the screen, a cold thrill running through my veins. Silverwood LLC, my father confirmed as if he heard me. The trap is perfectly set, Sloan. Madison and Donovan are currently popping expensive champagne celebrating their grand inheritance. They think they own a $36 million empire. They do not realize they just inherited a completely hollow shell. The Harrison Group has zero cash reserves, zero intellectual property, and zero real estate. What they actually inherited is $40 million in toxic, crushing corporate debt. My father took one final deep breath. He looked straight into the camera, his eyes filled with a terrifying mixture of pride and ruthless determination. They wanted the crown, Sloan. Let them wear it while the castle burns to the ground. You are the sole managing director of Silverwood LLC. You hold the deeds. You hold the patents. You hold the $40 million of debt. When the time is right, you tear them down. Do not show them an ounce of mercy, because they certainly will not show you any. I love you, my brilliant daughter. End of recording. The screen went black. The silence in the hotel room returned heavy and charged with raw electric power. I slowly closed the laptop. My pulse was completely steady, my mind sharper than a razor blade. My sister and her fraudulent husband thought they had won the ultimate lottery. They thought they had successfully discarded me to rule their glittering kingdom. But tomorrow morning, the sun would rise on a very different reality. Madison just eagerly accepted the legal ownership of a corporation that was $40 million in the red. And the sole absolute creditor holding the executioner's axe over her neck was none other than the sister she had just thrown into the freezing rain. 3 days had passed since I walked out of the freezing rain and into the warmth of the Sovereign Hotel. For 72 hours, I sat in my suite executing wire transfers, solidifying legal covenants, and quietly shifting the final pieces of my father's ultimate trap into place. Meanwhile, completely oblivious to the financial earthquake rumbling directly beneath their designer shoes, Madison and Donovan decided it was time to celebrate their grand victory. They headed straight for the city's most exclusive luxury marina. The sun was shining brightly as they strolled down the pristine teakwood dock. Madison was wearing a massive sun hat and a breezy silk dress that cost more than a down payment on a standard house. She held her phone high in the air live, streaming her entire morning to her thousands of envious followers. She angled the camera to capture the glittering ocean water and the massive multi-deck luxury yachts bobbing gently in the harbor. Donovan walked confidently beside her wearing crisp white linen trousers and a pair of dark designer sunglasses. He looked completely in his element, projecting the image of a fearless investment titan who had just conquered the corporate world. They were standing in front of a stunning 80-foot luxury vessel named the Oceanic Pearl. It featured a sleek, aerodynamic design, a rooftop jacuzzi, and a fully staffed entertainment deck. The price tag was a cool $2 million. For Madison, it was not a vessel. It was the ultimate social media prop. For Donovan, it was a floating casino and a testament to his untouchable ego. They walked up the boarding ramp with the absolute certainty of monarchs inspecting their new toy. A high-end yacht broker named Preston greeted them on the main deck with a chilled bottle of premium champagne already open. Preston catered exclusively to the ultra-wealthy, a man trained to spot old money and new money from a mile away. He poured the bubbling liquid into tall crystal flutes, handing them to Madison and Donovan with a polished, subservient smile. "Welcome aboard the Oceanic Pearl," Preston said smoothly. "I must say, Mr. and Mrs. Harrison, this vessel is the absolute crown jewel of our current inventory. With your new position at the head of the Harrison Group, it is only fitting that you command the finest ship in the harbor." Madison giggled, taking a large sip of her champagne. "It is absolutely perfect," she declared, waving her hand toward the luxurious lounge area. "I can already picture the launch party. We will invite the entire board of directors and every major investor in the city. We have to show everyone that the Harrison Group is bigger and better than ever under our control." Donovan leaned against the polished mahogany railing, projecting an aura of bored wealth. "We will take it today," Preston Donovan stated, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Have your crew fuel it up and stock the bar. We are not interested in financing or leasing options. We are executing a direct corporate purchase. The Harrison Group requires a vessel for executive entertainment. We will clear the transaction right now." Preston beamed, his eyes practically turning into dollar signs. A $2 million direct point-of-sale transaction meant a massive immediate commission for him. "Absolutely, sir," Preston replied, pulling a sleek wireless merchant terminal from his tailored jacket. "If you have your corporate purchasing card, we can process the payment and transfer the temporary registration within the hour." Donovan reached into his pocket with a slow, deliberate swagger. He pulled out his wallet and extracted the heavy, metallic corporate platinum card of the Harrison Group. He held it between his fingers for a fraction of a second, letting the sunlight catch the embossed letters of his name, making sure Preston understood the sheer financial weight of the plastic he was holding. He handed it over. Preston took the card with both hands, treating it like a fragile historical artifact. He slid the heavy metal through the wireless terminal. Madison held her phone up, making sure to record the exact moment they purchased a $2 million yacht on a Tuesday morning. She wanted the entire world to see her absolute financial dominance. The terminal screen lit up, processing the massive charge. It connected to the banking network, verifying the routing numbers against the corporate accounts. Donovan took another sip of his champagne, already looking out at the horizon, mentally calculating how many high-stakes poker games he could host in the lower deck lounge. Then a sharp, unpleasant electronic error tone shattered the tranquil atmosphere. Preston looked down at the terminal screen. His polished, subservient smile faltered for a brief second. A small crease of confusion appeared on his forehead. "My apologies, Mr. Harrison," Preston said, his voice maintaining a forced politeness. "It seems there is a slight communication error with the bank. The terminal is displaying a decline code. For a transaction of this magnitude, sometimes the fraud prevention protocols require a manual override. Let me just run it one more time." Donovan sighed loudly, rolling his eyes as if the minor delay was a profound personal insult. "Just run the chip," Preston Donovan commanded, tapping his fingers impatiently on the mahogany rail. "The account has a $10 million daily clearance limit. Your machine is probably just malfunctioning." Preston wiped a small bead of sweat from his brow and inserted the chip directly into the reader. The machine paused, thinking, processing the data through the global banking servers. Another sharp error tone rang out. Red text flashed across the small digital screen again. "Transaction denied. Account frozen." Madison lowered her phone, her perfectly glossed lips parting in confusion. "Donovan, what is going on?" she asked, a high-pitched edge of panic creeping into her voice. "Make him run it again. This is embarrassing. People are watching the live stream." Preston took a step back, holding the metal card out toward Donovan. "I am incredibly sorry," Sir Preston said, his tone entirely different now. The warmth was gone. It was replaced by the cold, calculating distance of a salesman who realizes his client might be a complete fraud. "The system is entirely operational. Your corporate bank is actively blocking the transaction. It is not a fraud alert, sir. The specific error code indicates a total lock on the institutional account level." Donovan snatched the card back from the broker, his face flushing with a mixture of intense anger and sudden creeping dread. "This is absurd," Donovan barked, pulling his cell phone from his pocket. "I am the acting chief executive of a $36 million corporation. I will have the senior vice president of the bank fired before lunch for this level of incompetence." Before Donovan could even dial the number, his own phone began to ring. The caller ID flashed brightly in the sunlight. It was the senior director of commercial lending at their primary corporate bank. Donovan answered the call, putting the phone to his ear with an aggressive, furious scowl. "Listen to me very carefully," Donovan began to shout. "I am standing on a yacht right now, and your defective system just declined my corporate card. You are going to lift this restriction immediately, or I am pulling every single dime of the Harrison Group out of your bank." There was no apology from the other end of the line. There was only a cold, deeply serious voice delivering a financial death sentence. "Mr. Harrison," the bank director stated flatly, cutting through Donovan's rage, "we are not lifting the restriction. As of 9 o'clock this morning, every single account line of credit and operational fund attached to the Harrison Group has been legally frozen by a court order. You have triggered a catastrophic default on a $40 million commercial debt covenant. Your primary creditor has enacted an immediate full asset seizure. You currently have zero available funds." Donovan felt the blood drain entirely from his face. The expensive champagne suddenly tasted like acid in his mouth. He looked at Madison, who was staring at him with wide, terrified eyes. The massive yacht beneath their feet no longer felt like a symbol of their ultimate victory. It felt like a floating coffin. The heavy glass doors of the downtown law firm swung open with alarming violence. Donovan marched through the reception area with the aggressive, panicked energy of a cornered predator. Madison trailed right behind him, her designer heels clicking furiously against the pristine marble floor. She was still wearing the expensive emerald silk dress from the luxury marina, but her glamorous aura had entirely evaporated. Her face was flushed bright red with indignation. Catherine brought up the rear, clutching her exclusive leather handbag so tightly her knuckles were white, demanding the receptionists step aside and clear their path. Donovan did not wait to be announced. He bypassed the terrified legal assistants and headed straight for the heavy oak doors of the senior partner's suite. He shoved the doors open with enough force to crack the solid wood against the wall stopper. He was breathing heavily, his custom Italian suit suddenly looking restrictive and suffocating. He was ready to scream, ready to threaten massive lawsuits and demand the immediate firing of every bank executive in the city. He was entirely convinced that a simple foolish clerical error had frozen his $36 million empire. But the angry words died instantly in his throat. Madison bumped into his back, letting out a frustrated shriek before she looked past his shoulder into the room. The absolute rage on her face morphed into pure, unadulterated shock. I was sitting in the high-backed leather guest chair directly across from Mitchell's massive desk. My legs were elegantly crossed. I was wearing a sharp, impeccably tailored black suit. I held a porcelain cup of black coffee in my right hand, the steam rising gently in the cool air-conditioned room. I did not flinch when the doors slammed open. I simply took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee and looked at the three of them over the rim of my cup. Madison completely lost her mind. She pointed a shaking finger at me, her voice hitting a screeching, hysterical pitch. "What is she doing here?" Madison screamed, turning her furious gaze toward the lawyer. "Mitchell, call your security guards right now. Have this pathetic homeless failure dragged out of your office immediately. We are dealing with a catastrophic banking error, and I will not have my disinherited sister sitting here listening to confidential corporate matters. She has absolutely no right to be in this building." Donovan stepped forward, slamming his hands flat onto Mitchell's polished desk. "Listen to me very carefully," Donovan barked, pointing a threatening finger at the older man. "The bank just froze every single operational account attached to the Harrison Group. They are claiming a massive default on our commercial debt covenants. You are the primary legal counsel for my corporation. I want you to draft an emergency injunction this exact second and force those incompetent bank directors to release my money. And get her out of this room before I call the police and have her arrested for corporate espionage." Catherine pushed her way to the front, desperately trying to maintain her crumbling aristocratic facade. She looked at me with absolute disgust, as if my very presence was infecting the air she breathed. "Sloane, you are completely out of line," Catherine hissed, her eyes narrowing into cold, judgmental slits. "I told you to take that cash call a taxi and disappear from our lives. We are dealing with a multi-million-dollar corporate crisis. You have absolutely no business being here. Get out of that chair and leave this instant before I ensure you never find a single accounting job in this entire state. You are an embarrassment to your father's memory." I did not move a single muscle. I did not raise my voice to defend myself. As a forensic accountant, my entire profession revolved around observing the microscopic details of human panic. I watched Donovan closely. A single bead of cold sweat rolled down the side of his face. His breathing was incredibly shallow. The slick, arrogant investment director was frantically doing mental math, trying to figure out which of his illegal offshore gambling accounts had triggered the freeze. He still thought he was the smartest man in the room. He had no idea the executioner was already sitting right in front of him. I simply placed my porcelain coffee cup gently onto the matching saucer. The soft clink of the ceramic echoed loudly in the tense, suffocating silence of the room. I folded my hands in my lap and gave my mother a blank, chilling stare. Mitchell did not reach for his telephone to call security. He did not scramble to his keyboard to draft a legal injunction to save Donovan's precious bank accounts. The subservient, accommodating family lawyer they thought they knew was completely gone. In his place sat a cold, calculating legal authority who held the keys to their absolute destruction. Mitchell slowly stood up from his leather chair. He did not say a single word to Donovan. He completely ignored Catherine's arrogant demands. He reached down into the lower drawer of his desk and pulled out a massive, incredibly thick stack of bound legal documents. The paperwork was bound with heavy black clips stamped with the official seals of the State Financial Regulatory Board. He raised the heavy stack of paper high in the air and slammed it violently down onto the polished oak desk. The loud, sharp crack of the paper hitting the wood sounded like a gunshot. Madison physically jumped backwards, her breath catching in her throat. Donovan flinched, his eyes darting nervously to the thick pile of contracts. Mitchell placed his hands flat on top of the documents. He looked directly at my sister, his eyes piercing right through her shallow, greedy facade. A dark, chilling smile spread across his weathered face. He let out a low, humorless chuckle that sent a visible shiver straight down Catherine's spine. Madison, Mitchell asked, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet, mocking whisper. Did you actually read the will? Madison stared at the old lawyer, as if he had suddenly started speaking an alien language. She crossed her arms tightly over her emerald silk dress, her diamond rings catching the bright overhead light. She let out a scoff that sounded thin, breathless, and completely terrified. Of course I read the will, Mitchell. She snapped, her voice trembling despite her attempt to sound authoritative. I inherited 100% of the Harrison Group. You read the valuation report yourself right at this very table. $36 million. That is my money. The bank made a ridiculous mistake, and you need to fix it right now before Donovan sues them into oblivion and takes your license with it. Donovan stepped up right beside his wife, trying to project his usual intimidating corporate presence. His dark eyes flicked aggressively from the thick stack of papers to Mitchell. We do not have time for your legal riddles, old man, Donovan warned, his deep voice dropping to a menacing octave. The corporate accounts are frozen tight. The yacht broker is waiting at the marina for a $2 million clearance. If you do not unfreeze those operational funds this exact second, I will personally see to it that this firm is dismantled piece by piece. Mitchell did not flinch at the threat. He did not even blink. He simply reached out and slowly peeled back the heavy cover of the bound legal documents, revealing a massive, incredibly detailed master ledger. It was a forensic accounting masterpiece, meticulously constructed by my father and me over 6 agonizing months in the shadows. You inherited the voting shares of the Harrison Group? Mitchell stated, his voice devoid of any human sympathy. You inherited the corporate entity Madison, and you are entirely correct about the gross asset valuation. It sits at exactly $36 million. Madison threw her hands up in exasperation, letting out a dramatic sigh of relief. Then what is the problem? She demanded loudly. Tell the bank director to release my cash. Mitchell turned the next page of the ledger. The problem, Madison, is that you only looked at the asset column on the balance sheet. You did not bother to look at the liabilities. A corporation is not a personal checking account. It is a delicate balancing act. And thanks to your husband's highly aggressive offshore investments and your own astronomical personal spending habits, the Harrison Group was forced to take on massive amounts of commercial debt just to keep the lights on. Donovan went entirely rigid. His breathing completely stopped. He knew exactly what he had done in the dark, but he thought he had buried those toxic numbers deep inside dummy corporations and fake real estate acquisitions. According to the legally binding commercial covenants you signed as investment director. Mitchell continued, staring directly into Donovan's panicked eyes. The Harrison Group currently carries exactly $40 million in toxic high-interest corporate debt. That debt was structured with incredibly strict performance clauses. When you attempted to wire $2 million for a luxury yacht this morning, you triggered an automatic, unchangeable default on the entire loan. Catherine stepped forward, her face completely drained of color. She gripped the back of a leather guest chair just to steady her trembling legs. That is impossible, my mother whispered, her voice cracking with sheer terror. Harrison would never allow his company to go $40 million into debt. The family estate alone is worth $8 million on the open market. Sell the corporate headquarters downtown, liquidate the regional manufacturing plants, pay off the loans and clear the debt right now. Mitchell shook his head slowly, preparing to deliver the next devastating blow. You cannot sell the estate, Catherine. You cannot liquidate the headquarters or the manufacturing plants to save yourselves. The Harrison Group does not own them anymore. Madison let out a sharp, horrifying gasp. What do you mean we do not own them? She shrieked, panic finally taking full control of her body. We have lived in that mansion my entire life. 6 months before his passing, your father initiated a massive, totally legal corporate restructuring program. Mitchell explained, tapping his silver pen against the heavy documents. He transferred the physical deeds of the family estate, the corporate office buildings, the land, and every single valuable patent into a private holding company. He then had that exact holding company purchase the entire $40 million debt portfolio of the Harrison Group on the secondary market. The Harrison Group is currently renting its own existence from a single absolute creditor. Donovan's large hands began to shake violently. He leaned his heavy frame over the desk, his voice reduced to a desperate gravelly whisper. "Who holds the debt, Mitchell? Who owns the holding company that holds the mortgage on the house?" Mitchell closed the heavy binder with a definitive thud. He looked past Donovan, ignoring him completely, and locked eyes with me. I placed my porcelain coffee cup down onto the glass table. I uncrossed my legs and stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored black suit. I walked slowly toward the center of the room. The sharp clicking of my heels on the hardwood floor sounded exactly like the ticking of a time bomb about to detonate. "You mocked me for studying forensic accounting, Donovan," I said, my voice echoing coldly in the silent office. "You asked me why I spent years learning to count other people's money. It was so I could find exactly where you buried yours. I tracked every single dollar you stole from my father. I tracked the illegal sports betting rings. I tracked the wire transfers to your offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. And while you were busy stealing the company blind to fund your gambling addiction, my father and I were busy buying up your toxic debt for pennies on the dollar." Madison stared at me, her mouth opening and closing wordlessly. She looked like she had just been struck by a speeding freight train. "The private holding company that owns your $40 million debt is Silverwood LLC," I stated clearly, letting the absolute crushing reality crash down on their heads. "The exact same Silverwood LLC that Dad left me in the will. The same company you laughed at yesterday. I own the mortgage on the family estate. I own the rights to the corporate name. I am the sole absolute creditor of the Harrison Group." I took one step closer, standing right in front of my sister. "You do not have $36 million, Madison. You are $4 million in the red. You are completely hopelessly bankrupt. And because I hold the execution order on your defaulted loans, I have the legal right to seize every remaining asset, including the designer clothes in your closet and the cars in your driveway, to satisfy the debt." The grand illusion shattered into a million jagged pieces. The glittering fantasy of endless wealth and high society dominance evaporated into thin air. Madison let out a horrifying guttural sob that tore from the bottom of her lungs. Her legs completely gave out beneath her. She collapsed directly onto the thick Persian rug, her expensive emerald dress pooling around her like dark green water. She gripped her hair with both hands, hyperventilating wildly as the reality of her absolute financial ruin crushed the breath right out of her chest. In less than 10 minutes, she had gone from a billionaire heiress to an insolvent debtor facing total annihilation. Catherine stood frozen in sheer terror, her hands covering her mouth as she stared down at her golden child, sobbing uncontrollably on the floor. She slowly looked up at me, her eyes wide with shock, finally realizing that the daughter she had heartlessly thrown into the freezing rain was now the supreme, untouchable ruler of their entire existence. Donovan did not fall to the floor. He slowly turned his head to look at me. The arrogant, slick corporate charm was entirely gone. His dark eyes were wide and burning with a toxic, venomous hatred. His jaw clenched so tightly I could hear his teeth grinding together in the quiet room. He had been completely outsmarted, trapped inside a financial cage of his own making, and he knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that the key was firmly locked in my hand. Donovan did not accept defeat. Men who build their entire existence on fraud never simply surrender when the lights turn on. They double down. He grabbed Madison by the arm, hauling her up from the floor, and dragged her out of Mitchell's office without saying another word. Catherine followed them, her face a mask of terror. They knew they could not win against me in a courtroom or a boardroom. My documentation was flawless. My legal claim was absolute. So Donovan immediately pivoted to the only battlefield where facts did not matter. He took the fight to the court of public opinion. He was a master of manipulation. He understood that in modern society, the first person to cry on the internet usually dictates the narrative. He utilized his shady media connections and immediately hired a crisis public relations firm. They had a very narrow window before the court ordered sheriffs to physically evict them from the family estate, and Donovan intended to use every single second of it to destroy me. That evening, a highly orchestrated video appeared across every major social media platform. It was posted from Madison's influencer account, which already boasted hundreds of thousands of followers. I watched the video from the quiet solitude of my hotel suite. The production value was disgustingly perfect. Madison sat on the edge of the plush sofa in the estate's living room. She wore an oversized plain beige sweater. Her usually flawless hair was tied back in a messy knot. She wore absolutely no makeup, ensuring the dark circles under her eyes were completely visible. She looked like a fragile, traumatized victim who had just endured a horrific tragedy. "My older sister Sloane is a certified forensic accountant," Madison said to the camera, her voice trembling with perfectly rehearsed sorrow. "While my husband and I were busy running the Harrison Group and trying to keep our employees paid, my sister was doing something unthinkable. She used her specialized financial knowledge to forge complex corporate documents. She took advantage of our father while he was dying of terminal cancer. She isolated him in his final weeks, manipulated his medications, and forced him to sign away the entire family legacy to a secret shell company." Madison paused, letting a single highly practiced tear roll down her cheek. "Now, just days after we buried our father, she is trying to throw my mother and me out onto the street. She froze our corporate bank accounts and is trying to bankrupt the company our father built from nothing. I am making this video because we are terrified. My sister is a financial predator, and she has stolen absolutely everything." Donovan did not just rely on organic reach. He poured whatever hidden cash he had left into algorithmic boosting, ensuring the video bypassed normal filters and landed directly on the trending pages of every major platform. The internet devoured it. Modern social media thrives on outrage, and Donovan had just served them a perfectly framed villain. I was painted as the greedy, soulless accountant who committed elder abuse to steal a $36 million empire from her grieving innocent younger sister. The video hit 1 million views in less than 4 hours. Then it hit 5 million. The backlash was immediate and visceral, but Donovan did not stop there. He knew an internet video was only the spark. To create a true inferno, he needed traditional media validation. The very next morning, Catherine appeared on the most watched local morning news broadcast in the state. She sat opposite a sympathetic television anchor dressed in entirely black mourning attire, clutching a tissue in her trembling hands. "I gave birth to her." Catherine sobbed on live television, her voice cracking with dramatic devastation. "I loved her with all my heart, but Sloane has always been broken inside. She is a cold-blooded, calculating monster." She watched her father wither away in a hospice bed and only saw dollar signs. She forged those holding company papers to strip Madison of her rightful inheritance. "We are fighting for our lives against my own flesh and blood. I do not even recognize the woman she has become." The news anchor looked at the camera with grave concern, asking the audience how a daughter could commit such a heinous act of corporate theft and elder abuse. They flashed a highly edited, unflattering photo of me on the screen, branding me as the mastermind behind a massive family fraud. My phone began to physically vibrate off the surface of the hotel desk. The notifications were coming in so fast, the screen simply blurred into a continuous stream of white light. Strangers had managed to find my personal phone number and my professional email address. I opened my inbox. It was completely flooded. There were thousands of messages pouring in by the minute. People I had never met were sending me detailed, horrific death threats. They called me a sociopath, a criminal, a disgusting parasite who deserved to rot in federal prison. My professional social media pages were overrun with thousands of comments demanding I be investigated by the FBI, demanding I be stripped of my accounting licenses, and demanding I return the money I supposedly stole from my grieving family. The public narrative had completely shifted. Donovan and Madison had successfully weaponized their tears, transforming their massive corporate embezzlement into a story of my supposed tyranny. They were rallying millions of angry citizens to their defense, using the sheer weight of public outrage to try and force me into surrendering the deeds to the estate. I sat in the glow of my multi-monitor setup, watching the hatred multiply across the internet. The digital mob was screaming for my absolute destruction. My firm, my reputation, and my safety were under direct, massive assault. Donovan thought this wave of public terror would break me. He thought the thousands of death threats would make me cower and sign the surrender documents just to make the nightmare stop. My phone vibrated against the mahogany desk, a sharp and angry buzz that cut through the silence of the hotel suite. The caller ID displayed the name of the senior managing partner at my forensic accounting firm. I already knew exactly what he was going to say before I even answered the call. The digital mob had not just attacked my personal inbox. They had flooded the corporate switchboards of my employer. I picked up the phone, my voice completely level. "Sloan, we have a catastrophic situation on our hands," the managing partner said, his tone thick with exhaustion and panic. "The firm is being actively targeted. Our top-tier corporate clients are calling my office directly demanding to know why we are employing a woman accused of elder abuse and massive financial fraud. The news broadcast is playing on loop in the lobby. We are a firm built on absolute financial integrity. We cannot have this kind of catastrophic public relations nightmare attached to our brand." I did not interrupt him. I let him panic. The executive board just held an emergency vote. He continued, sounding genuinely regretful but entirely resolute. "We have no choice, Sloan. We are placing you on immediate, indefinite administrative leave. We are suspending your corporate access until this entire family dispute is resolved in a court of law." "I am sorry." "You do not need to apologize," I replied smoothly, staring at the flashing notifications on my computer screen. "It is the correct tactical move to protect the firm's liability. I will see you when the dust settles." I ended the call and placed the phone back onto the desk. A normal person would have broken down right then and there. A normal person wouldn't have felt the crushing weight of losing their prestigious career, their public reputation, and their family, all in the span of 72 hours. My phone chimed again. This time it was a direct text message from Madison. She must have had her crisis management team monitoring my firm's public statements, waiting for the exact moment I was suspended. She wanted to strike while she assumed I was bleeding. I opened the message. "I hope you are enjoying the show," Madison wrote, her text dripping with venomous triumph. "Your firm just threw you out. The entire country knows exactly what kind of monster you really are. You are losing everything, Sloan. But I can make it all stop. Sign the legal deeds to Silverwood over to Donovan and me by midnight. Hand over the $40 million debt holding. If you sign the papers, I will take down the video. I will go on television and say it was all a terrible misunderstanding. Refuse and I will make sure your reputation is permanently destroyed. You will never work in this industry again. You will be a complete outcast." I stared at the glowing text on the screen. Madison actually believed she held the winning hand. She thought public shame was the ultimate weapon because in her shallow, influencer-obsessed mind, public perception was the only currency that mattered. She believed that if a million strangers hated me, I would simply surrender my empire to make them stop. I did not type a reply. I did not log on to my social media accounts to issue a frantic, desperate denial. I did not beg a journalist for an interview to clear my name. Arguing with a digital mob is a fool's errand. When you are standing in a pit of vipers, you do not waste your breath trying to convince the snakes you are innocent. You simply cut off their heads. I powered down my personal cell phone and tossed it into the hotel safe. I walked over to the heavy oak dining table in the center of the penthouse suite. I unzipped my secondary travel case and extracted my heavy-duty custom-built forensic workstation. Within minutes, I had linked 3 high-resolution monitors together, creating a massive glowing command center right in the middle of the room. I booted up my encrypted operating system, bypassed the standard commercial firewalls, and dove straight into the deep, dark financial underbelly of the global banking network. Donovan thought his media circus would distract me. He thought the public outcry would paralyze my investigative skills. He severely underestimated the cold, calculated focus of a woman who had nothing left to lose. I brought up the initial wire transfer logs I had secured months ago from my father's shadow audit. Donovan had been siphoning millions from the Harrison Group into offshore gambling syndicates. But as I stared at the routing numbers, my instincts as a forensic accountant began to scream at me. The transactions were too layered. They were too meticulously obscured for a simple gambling addict. A man just trying to cover his poker losses does not utilize a dozen different shell corporations registered in Cyprus, the Cayman Islands, and the Seychelles just to move a few $1 million. That level of extreme financial obfuscation required a highly sophisticated, deliberate laundering network. I cracked my knuckles, letting the soothing, rhythmic clatter of my mechanical keyboard fill the silent hotel room. I initiated a reverse trace on a specific set of wire transfers Donovan had executed last year. I bypassed the dummy corporations he set up under Madison's name and dug directly into the recipient accounts in the Cayman Islands. I utilized a specialized algorithm designed to track the digital footprints of illicit funds. The data began to populate across my 3 screens in a cascading waterfall of numbers and routing codes. I watched as Donovan's stolen money hit the offshore accounts, but it did not stop there. The funds were instantly split into hundreds of microtransactions, bouncing rapidly across international borders to evade financial regulatory flags. This was a classic layering technique, the exact signature of a professional money laundering operation. I leaned closer to the glowing screens, my eyes tracking the final destination of the dispersed funds. The money was not just paying off dangerous bookies. It was being quietly funneled into a network of highly suspect, unregulated international charities. Donovan had set up fake philanthropic organizations as the ultimate endpoint to wash the dirty money completely clean. A chilling realization washed over me. Donovan was not just stealing from the Harrison Group to feed his own degenerate habits. He was actively utilizing my father's corporation as a massive illegal washing machine for a much larger, darker criminal syndicate. He was laundering millions of dollars of dirty money through his fake investments and filtering it out through fake charities. Madison thought a viral video was going to destroy me. She had absolutely no idea that her arrogant, slick husband had just handed me the digital blueprint to a massive federal crime. I did not need to win an argument on the internet. I just needed to hand this encrypted hard drive to the right authorities, and Donovan would not just be bankrupt. He would be locked inside a federal penitentiary for the rest of his natural life. I packed up my mobile workstation in complete silence. The encrypted hotel network was sufficient for preliminary tracing, but it was nowhere near secure enough for what I needed to do next. To pull down the massive terabyte-sized files of international banking logs without triggering a federal cybersecurity tripwire. I needed the custom-built hardline server rack sitting inside my own apartment across the city. I slipped out of the hotel through the underground service elevator, avoiding the lobby entirely. I took a winding indirect route back to my high-rise apartment, constantly checking my rearview mirror for any vehicles following me. Donovan was desperate, and desperate men with millions of dollars on the line do not play by the rules. Once inside my apartment, I locked the heavy steel deadbolt and immediately engaged the secondary security system. The digital keypad chirped a reassuring tone, confirming the perimeter was secure. I walked straight into my home office and booted up my primary mainframe. The cooling fans roared to life, sounding like a jet engine preparing for takeoff. I sat down in my ergonomic chair and cracked my neck. It was time to completely dissect Donovan and his criminal empire. I opened the offshore data packets I had intercepted earlier. Forensic accounting is not just about adding and subtracting numbers. It is digital archaeology. You have to brush away the layers of dirt to find the bones of the crime. Donovan had buried his financial skeletons incredibly deep, but he had made one fatal, arrogant mistake. He used the exact same IP addresses to authorize the Harrison Group wire transfers that he used to manage his fake philanthropic funds. I isolated the IP logs and initiated a deep packet inspection. The data unspooled across my massive ultra-wide monitors in a beautiful damning stream of undeniable guilt. Donovan was not just a greedy executive funding a lavish lifestyle for Madison. He was a professional washer for a highly organized, vicious criminal syndicate. I pulled up the incorporation documents for 3 specific charities receiving the bulk of the offshore funds. They had generic benevolent-sounding names: the Global Urban Development Fund, the Clean Horizon Initiative, the Future Scholars Trust. On paper, they looked like noble causes fighting poverty and building schools in developing nations. In reality, they were sophisticated black holes designed to swallow dirty street money and spit out clean, untaxable corporate assets. I cross-referenced the board of directors for these fake charities against international criminal databases. The names listed as the primary beneficiaries were not philanthropists. They were known associates of violent transnational cartels. They were individuals heavily monitored by global intelligence agencies for narcotics trafficking and illegal arms dealing. The sheer scale of the operation was breathtaking. I traced the specific methodology Donovan was using. It was a classic integration loop executed with terrifying precision. First, the syndicate would funnel millions of dollars of dirty physical cash into the offshore gambling rings Donovan frequented. Donovan would then intentionally lose massive amounts of clean corporate cash from the Harrison Group at those exact same virtual poker tables, effectively swapping clean money for dirty money. Next, he would route the newly mixed funds through a maze of shell companies in Cyprus and the Seychelles, a process known as layering. Finally, the money would be donated back into the fake charities under the guise of anonymous philanthropic grants. The cartel received their washed, legitimate funds, and Donovan took a massive multi-million-dollar commission off the top to fund Madison's grotesque shopping habits and his own luxury lifestyle. He was deeply entangled with extremely dangerous people. The $40 million debt he had strapped onto the Harrison Group was not just a bank loan. It was likely leverage demanded by the syndicate to ensure he kept the washing machine running. When I froze the Harrison Group operational accounts by activating the Silverwood LLC covenants, I did not just cut off his supply of champagne and luxury yachts. I completely severed the main artery of a transnational criminal laundering operation. Donovan was not just facing public humiliation. He was facing the terrifying wrath of a cartel that had just lost their primary financial pipeline. I began downloading every single piece of evidence. I pulled the Swift network routing numbers, the forged digital signatures, the IP logs, and the specific dates of the offshore transfers. I compiled the data into a master file that would make any federal prosecutor weep with absolute joy. This was not a simple civil dispute over a family will anymore. This was a flawless, undeniable blueprint for a massive federal racketeering indictment. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a military-grade biometric encrypted hard drive. I plugged it into the secure terminal and initiated the massive data transfer. The progress bar flashed onto the center screen, estimating 3 minutes until completion. I watched the green bar slowly creep across the monitor. 10%, 30%, 50%. Every single byte of data transferring onto that drive was another nail in the coffin for Donovan and Madison. They thought they could use a viral video to ruin my life. They were bringing a plastic knife to a thermonuclear war. 80%, 90%. The progress bar hit 100%. The system chimed, confirming the master file was completely transferred and locked behind a biometric encryption wall. I pulled the heavy metal drive from the port and slipped it into the inner pocket of my jacket. I finally had the absolute power to destroy them. A sharp, piercing electronic alarm suddenly shattered the dead silence of my apartment. The sound was deafening. It was the perimeter breach alert from my secondary security system. The digital panel on the wall flashed a blinding, urgent red light. Warning, front door breach detected. Warning, deadbolt compromised. I froze my eyes, locking onto the flashing red panel. The heavy steel door of my apartment shuddered violently. Someone on the other side was not just picking the lock, they were actively taking a battering ram to the reinforced frame. Wood splintered and cracked with a sickening crunch. The heavy metal deadbolt groaned under the immense brute force impact. They had found me. Another massive, deafening crash echoed through the hallway. The door frame splintered completely, the security chain snapping like a dry twig. The front door kicked violently open, slamming hard against the interior wall. The alarm continued to scream, filling the apartment with a chaotic, terrifying noise. I stood perfectly still behind my desk, my hand resting firmly on the encrypted hard drive in my pocket, staring down the dark hallway as heavy, aggressive footsteps crossed the threshold of my home. The heavy footsteps echoed against the hardwood floor. Donovan stepped into the glow of my home office monitors. Water dripped from his expensive leather shoes, leaving a trail of dark mud across my pristine floor. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his soaked, custom-tailored shirt. The slick, arrogant executive facade he wore at the luxury marina had completely melted away. In his place stood a desperate, cornered animal. He reached over to the wall panel and smashed his fist against the security console, shattering the plastic casing and killing the blaring siren. The sudden dead silence in the apartment was almost more deafening than the alarm itself. He crossed the room in 3 long strides. He was a massive man, easily a foot taller than me, with broad shoulders built from years of expensive personal training sessions paid for by my father's company. He used that physical advantage entirely. He leaned over my desk, planting his heavy hands on the glass surface, casting a dark, imposing shadow over my workspace. He tried to physically dominate the room, invading my personal space to trigger a panic response. As a forensic accountant who routinely investigated transnational money laundering, my personal security protocols were military grade. Donovan thought he was breaking into the home of a defenseless desk worker. He did not realize he had just forcefully entered a highly monitored, digitally fortified vault. I did not step back. I kept my hand casually resting inside my jacket pocket, my fingers brushing against the cold metal of the encrypted hard drive. I looked up at him with a completely blank, analytical stare. "You think you are untouchable, Sloane." Donovan growled, his voice a deep, menacing rumble that vibrated through the glass desk. He reached inside his wet shirt pocket and pulled out a thick, folded legal document. He slammed it down onto my desk with brutal force. "You think you can just freeze my operational accounts and steal my wife's inheritance right out from under her? You are nothing but a pathetic, jealous spinster who could never achieve a fraction of what Madison and I have built together." He unrolled the damp document. It was a complete, unconditional transfer of ownership for Silverwood LLC. He pulled a heavy silver pen from his pocket and threw it on top of the papers. The metal clattered loudly against the glass. "Sign it!" Donovan commanded, his dark eyes burning with toxic fury. "Sign over the holding company and release the debt covenants right now. If you do not put your name on that dotted line this exact second, I will completely annihilate your entire existence." I looked down at the hastily drafted contract. It was a desperate, sloppy piece of legal work, a frantic attempt to regain control of the laundering pipeline before his cartel associates realized their money was locked inside frozen accounts. He was not just angry about losing the mansion or the yacht. He was utterly terrified of the violent, dangerous men waiting for their clean cash. That viral video Madison posted is just a small taste of what I can do. Donovan threatened, leaning his massive frame even closer. "I have media connections across the entire country. If you refuse to sign this, I will fabricate financial records linking you directly to corporate fraud. I will hire witnesses to testify under oath that you are mentally unstable, that you isolated a dying man, and that you manipulated him into changing his will. I will drag your professional reputation through the mud until your forensic accounting license is permanently revoked by the state board. You will never work in the financial sector again. You will not be able to rent a decent apartment or open a basic bank account. I will ruin you so thoroughly that you will wish you had never been born. I maintained my ice-cold composure. His threats were graphic, loud, and vicious, but they were simply the desperate gasps of a drowning man thrashing in deep water. "Are you deaf?" Sloan Donovan shouted, slamming his hand on the desk again, causing my computer monitors to shake. "Pick up the pen and sign the damn paper before I lose my temper and make you regret it." I slowly withdrew my empty hand from my pocket. I looked him dead in the eyes, showing absolutely zero fear. I picked up the silver pen. I did not argue. I did not try to negotiate or plead for mercy. I knew the law intimately. A contract signed under the imminent threat of physical violence and explicit blackmail is entirely void ab initio. It holds zero weight in any legitimate court. By forcing me to sign it inside my own forcefully breached home, he had not secured a $36 million corporation. He had secured his own criminal indictment. I simply clicked the pen open, leaned over the glass desk, and signed my name on the bottom line of the transfer document, with smooth, elegant strokes. Donovan let out a sharp, victorious breath. He snatched the paper off the desk so fast he nearly tore the edges. He looked down at my signature, a wide, arrogant smile returning to his face. The illusion of his supreme dominance was instantly restored. He had used brute force and blackmail, and he firmly believed it had worked perfectly. "That is exactly what I thought," Donovan sneered, folding the paper and shoving it back into his shirt pocket. "You always fold when the pressure gets real. You are weak, Sloan. You have always been weak. Enjoy your miserable, lonely life." He turned his back to me, rolling his shoulders as if a massive physical weight had been lifted off them. He strutted out of my office, his heavy boots crunching over the splintered wood of my broken front door. He genuinely believed he had just intimidated me into surrendering a $40 million corporate empire to save my own skin. I waited until the sound of his footsteps completely disappeared down the hallway corridor. I did not panic. I did not tremble. I simply turned my head toward the far corner of my home office. Sitting quietly on a sleek wooden stand was a high-end cylindrical air purifier. Hidden flawlessly inside the dark mesh grating of the ventilation grill was a microscopic ultra-high-definition security lens. The tiny green recording light was perfectly steady. It had captured the violently broken door. It had captured Donovan's aggressive physical intimidation. And most importantly, the highly sensitive parabolic microphone had captured every single crystal-clear syllable of his felony extortion and blackmail threats. I had just traded a meaningless, legally unenforceable piece of paper signed under obvious duress for the exact criminal evidence needed to put him in a federal prison cell. I secured the shattered doorframe as best as I could and immediately uploaded the high-definition security footage to my encrypted cloud server. The video of Donovan smashing his way into my home and extorting my signature was the final nail in his coffin. I forwarded the entire digital package to Mitchell with a single instruction to prepare the federal filings. While I was meticulously building a flawless legal trap, my mother and sister were busy building a fragile house of cards. Donovan returned to the family estate and undoubtedly presented the extorted transfer document as a massive definitive victory. Madison and Catherine blindly believed they had successfully crushed me. They thought the $36 million empire was officially theirs again. But Donovan knew the clock was ticking down to zero. He knew the offshore accounts were still locked tight, and the dangerous syndicate was demanding their washed cash immediately. He needed an immediate influx of clean capital to placate the violent men breathing down his neck. So he convinced my mother and sister to do what they did best. They decided to throw an incredibly lavish party. It was billed as the most exclusive philanthropic event of the entire season. Catherine and Madison utilized their lifelong country club connections to organize a massive charity gala. They sent out gold-embossed invitations to every major politician, corporate executive, and wealthy socialite in the city. The official narrative was a disgusting masterpiece of public relations manipulation. They claimed the gala was a tribute to my late father, a night to raise funds for urban development initiatives and child welfare programs. In reality, The event was a desperate high-stakes money grab designed by a cornered criminal. Donovan had borrowed heavily from his violent underworld associates just to fund the extravagant catering, the premium open bar, and the celebrity entertainment. He planned to use the charitable donations from the city elite to temporarily cover his massive syndicate deficit. He was going to take the checks written by my father's old friends and hand them directly to organized crime bosses. Madison spent days flaunting her custom designer gowns on social media, using the viral sympathy from her fake crying video to drum up ticket sales. She posted daily updates about how hard it was to plan a charity event while grieving, milking every ounce of public pity she could muster. Catherine was right beside her, giving interviews to local lifestyle magazines about her dedication to philanthropy. They were attempting to wash their ruined reputation and steal from their wealthy friends all in one glamorous, highly publicized evening. They felt invincible, surrounded by the adoring comments of internet strangers and the false security of Donovan's extorted contract. The event was hosted at the absolute pinnacle of high society, the Grand Heritage Country Club. It was a sprawling, fiercely gated property with lush, manicured grounds and a massive ballroom decorated with cascading floral arrangements and imported crystal lighting. Catherine and Madison stood at the grand entrance, greeting the incoming billionaires and local celebrities with warm, heavily practiced smiles. They played the role of the grieving but resilient family, perfectly accepting condolences and large donation envelopes with equal grace. Behind the scenes, Donovan was managing a small army of private security contractors. He was terrified that I might show up and expose the extorted signature before he could collect the donations. He handed a printed photograph of my face to the head of the security detail with strict, absolute orders. He demanded that I be placed on a permanent, non-negotiable blacklist. If I even stepped foot near the front gates, the guards were instructed to physically remove me from the premises and call the local police for trespassing. Donovan wanted an impenetrable fortress to execute his final, desperate financial scam. He stalked the perimeter of the ballroom in his tailored tuxedo, his eyes constantly scanning the entrances, sweating despite the cool air conditioning. He thought a few men in cheap suits and earpieces could keep the executioner at bay. He thought his stolen paper contract made him the king of the castle. The grand ballroom was packed with the wealthiest figures in the state, all sipping expensive champagne and writing massive checks to a completely fraudulent charity. The valet line was a continuous glittering stream of luxury sports cars and imported sedans. The security team stood by the velvet ropes, carefully scrutinizing every single guest. They were watching for a disgraced, defeated woman trying to sneak through the side doors. They were completely unprepared for a frontal assault. A massive jet-black armored limousine smoothly pulled into the circular driveway, bypassing the regular valet queue entirely. The heavy tires crunched aggressively against the pristine gravel as the long vehicle came to a complete stop directly in front of the main entrance. The security guards immediately tensed, reaching for their radios, unsure of how to handle a vehicle that commanded such sheer, undeniable power. The chauffeur stepped out and swiftly opened the rear passenger door. I did not sneak in. I did not hide my face. I stepped out of the armored vehicle and placed my designer stiletto firmly onto the pavement. I was wearing a floor-length, blood-red evening gown that commanded absolute authority and demanded the attention of every single person in the vicinity. My hair was styled flawlessly, and I wore no jewelry other than a simple, elegant diamond necklace. I adjusted my posture, projecting total dominance and cold calculation. I locked my eyes onto the brightly lit grand entrance of the country club, ignoring the panicked security guards moving toward me, and began walking straight into the heart of their glittering, fraudulent empire. The heavy tires of the armored limousine crunched against the pristine gravel of the circular driveway. The massive vehicle smoothly pulled away, leaving me standing alone at the base of the grand marble staircase. The crisp evening air barely ruffled the fabric of my blood-red evening gown. I ascended the stairs with slow, deliberate precision. The flash of valet headlights illuminated the sheer panic on the faces of the private security detail. Three men in cheap, poorly fitted dark suits rushed forward, forming a human barricade directly across the opulent entryway. The lead guard held up his hand, his eyes darting frantically between my face and a printed photograph he held crumpled in his palm. I did not break my stride until the very last second, stopping mere inches from his outstretched hand. I looked at him with an expression of pure, unyielding ice. "You are not on the guest list, ma'am," the guard stammered, his voice lacking any real authority. "Mr. Donovan gave us strict instructions. You are blacklisted from this property." Before I could even offer a response to the trembling guard, the heavy brass-handled doors of the main foyer burst open. Madison marched out into the cool night air, her face twisted into an ugly, furious scowl that completely ruined her expensive designer makeup. She was wearing a massive, overly elaborate silver gown that made her look like a walking disco ball. Catherine followed closely behind her, clutching a crystal champagne flute, her eyes wide with manufactured outrage. The commotion instantly drew the attention of the high society guests lingering near the entrance. Billionaires, local politicians, and powerful corporate executives stopped their polite conversations, their eyes locking onto the unfolding drama. "What exactly do you think you are doing here?" Madison shrieked, her voice echoing loudly across the pristine courtyard. She pointed a trembling manicured finger right at my face. "You have absolutely no right to show your face at our exclusive charity event. You are an uninvited fraud. You are a disgusting criminal who tried to steal our father's legacy." Catherine quickly stepped up beside her golden child, immediately playing to the wealthy audience watching from the foyer. She placed a hand over her chest, feigning a look of profound maternal heartbreak. "Please, everyone," Catherine announced loudly, making sure her voice carried to the wealthy donors standing on the marble steps. "This is my estranged daughter. She is deeply disturbed. She forged legal documents to rob our family while my husband was in hospice care. She is a dangerous, manipulative liar who wants to ruin this beautiful night of philanthropy. Please do not listen to a single word she says. She is just trying to extort us." I stood perfectly still, letting their venom wash over me without flinching a single muscle. As a forensic accountant, I was trained to separate emotional noise from hard data. The data here was simple. They were completely terrified. The elite guests began to whisper among themselves, sipping their expensive drinks, eager to consume the scandalous family drama. I saw Donovan lurking in the shadows just inside the glass doors. He wore a smug, victorious grin. He tapped the breast pocket of his custom tuxedo, silently signaling that he still possessed the transfer document he had violently extorted from me in my apartment. He genuinely believed that worthless piece of paper made him the untouchable king of the city. He thought the millions of dollars he was currently stealing from these elite guests would wash his criminal slate clean. Madison turned her furious gaze toward the head security guard. "I gave you a direct order." Madison barked, her voice cracking with arrogant entitlement. "She is trespassing on an exclusive private property. Grab her by the arms and physically throw her off this estate right now. If she resists, call the police and have her thrown into a filthy jail cell where she belongs. Do it, or I will have every single one of you fired before midnight." The guards stepped forward, their hands reaching out to grab my bare shoulders. I did not retreat. I simply leveled a stare so terrifyingly calm that the lead guard froze completely in his tracks. "You really do not want to make the mistake of touching me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying absolute, undeniable authority. Madison let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "You have zero power here, Sloane," Madison sneered, stepping closer to gloat in my face. "You lost. Donovan made sure of it. Now get out of my sight before I make you regret ever stepping out of that limousine." Suddenly, a loud, frantic commotion erupted from deep inside the country club. The heavy mahogany doors swung violently open once again. Mr. Kensington, the distinguished and highly respected president of the Grand Heritage Country Club, sprinted out onto the marble portico. He was an older, normally composed man, but tonight he moved with desperate urgency. His face was flushed red and completely covered in a cold sweat. He pushed his way violently through the crowd of wealthy guests, completely ignoring Catherine and Madison. He shoved the confused security guards aside with surprising force, clearing a wide, unobstructed path directly to me. Madison crossed her arms, a triumphant smirk returning to her face as she looked at the club president. Finally, Madison declared loudly for the entire crowd to hear. "Mr. Kensington, please instruct your security team to remove this trespassing fraud from our charity gala immediately. She is ruining the atmosphere for our generous donors." Mr. Kensington did not even look at my sister. He did not acknowledge my mother. He stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me, straightened his expensive suit jacket with shaking hands, and bowed forward in a gesture of absolute undeniable subservience. He reached over to the valet podium and snatched a wireless microphone that was used for parking announcements. He turned to face the massive crowd of stunned billionaires, influential politicians, and the arrogant members of my treacherous family. The loud feedback from the microphone sliced through the cool night air, commanding total silence. "My deepest and most sincere apologies to everyone for this completely unacceptable disruption," Mr. Kensington announced through the microphone, his voice booming clearly across the entire manicured estate. He gestured respectfully toward me with an open hand, his posture remaining slightly bowed. "Please step back and show absolute respect. This is Ms. Sloane. She is the sole exclusive owner of this entire property. Silverwood, LLC, completely finalized the absolute acquisition of the Grand Heritage Country Club this afternoon. She is not trespassing. She is the supreme authority of this estate, and anyone who disrespects her will be permanently expelled from these grounds immediately." The heavy silence that fell over the courtyard was absolute. Mr. Kensington stood with his head still bowed, completely submissive to the new owner of the ground he stood on. Madison opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror as the reality of my newly acquired asset crashed down upon her. Catherine dropped her crystal champagne flute. The expensive glass shattered against the marble steps, the sharp sound echoing through the frozen crowd. I did not spare them a single glance. I stepped past my mother and sister, my blood-red gown sweeping gracefully over the threshold of my property. I walked directly into the grand ballroom. The space was a breathtaking display of stolen wealth. Thousands of white orchids cascaded from the vaulted ceilings. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over the circular dining tables. Hundreds of the most powerful politicians, real estate tycoons, and corporate investors in the state were gathered inside. They were all holding heavy checkbooks, ready to pour their legitimate capital into a massive, glittering black hole. At the far end of the room stood an elevated mahogany stage. A massive digital projection screen hung behind the podium, currently displaying a highly produced, emotionally manipulative video loop of smiling children and fake charitable missions. Donovan was standing near the front row, his chest puffed out in his custom tuxedo, holding a microphone. He was just moments away from delivering a fraudulent keynote speech designed to empty the pockets of every single guest in the room. I walked straight down the center aisle. The wealthy donors parted like the Red Sea, their eyes drawn to the absolute authority in my stride. I reached the stage and ascended the short flight of stairs. Donovan saw me approaching. His arrogant smile vanished instantly. His dark eyes widened in sheer panic. He reached into his tuxedo pocket, instinctively grabbing the extorted transfer document as if it were a physical shield. He took a step forward to block my path. I did not even break my pace. I walked right past his massive frame, completely ignoring his presence. I approached the central podium. The audiovisual technician sitting at the control desk looked up at me in confusion. I did not ask for permission. I reached down, unplugged the primary display cable from his laptop, and connected it directly into my own encrypted military-grade tablet. The massive projection screen behind me flickered. The fake, heartwarming images of the charitable foundation instantly disappeared. In their place, a stark, terrifyingly complex forensic accounting diagram illuminated the entire ballroom. It was a massive digital web of glowing red lines, offshore routing numbers, and deeply concealed corporate entities. The room let out a collective gasp. I adjusted the microphone on the podium. My voice rang out clear, cold, and utterly commanding. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," I announced, my gaze sweeping across the sea of powerful faces. "Welcome to the Grand Heritage Country Club. As the sole owner of this estate, I want to thank you all for attending tonight. You were invited here under the premise of philanthropy. You were told that your generous donations would fund urban development and international child welfare. You have been sold a beautifully orchestrated catastrophic lie." A low murmur of confusion rippled through the audience. I tapped the screen of my tablet. The massive projection zoomed in on a specific cluster of offshore accounts. "I am a forensic accountant," I stated, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. "I specialize in tracking the digital footprints of illicit capital." The man standing to my left, Donovan, is not a philanthropic visionary. He is a professional money launderer operating a massive integration loop for a transnational criminal syndicate. Donovan lunged toward the podium. "Cut the microphone," he roared at the audiovisual technician. "Turn off that screen right now. She is a deranged, bitter woman spreading malicious lies." I simply tapped my tablet again. A high-definition, crystal-clear audio recording blasted through the ballroom surround sound speakers. It was the exact recording from my apartment. Donovan's voice echoed with violent, terrifying clarity. Everyone in the room heard him explicitly threaten my life. Everyone heard him brag about fabricating financial records and committing extortion. The undeniable proof of his violent, criminal true nature silenced his desperate protests instantly. I turned back to the audience. "Please direct your attention to the red routing lines on the screen behind me," I instructed calmly. "Those lines represent the exact trajectory of every single dollar you donate tonight. You are not writing checks to the Global Urban Development Fund or the Clean Horizon Initiative. Those are sophisticated shell corporations registered in Cyprus and the Seychelles." I tapped the screen one more time. A list of names appeared in bold black text next to the charity logos. The individuals listed as the primary beneficiaries of those charities are not relief workers, I explained, looking directly at a prominent state senator sitting in the front row. They are heavily monitored associates of organized cartels. They use these fake philanthropic events to wash millions of dollars of dirty physical cash. Donovan takes your clean, highly untaxable donations and funnels them directly into accounts controlled by violent criminals. He takes a massive commission off the top to fund his luxury lifestyle and his wife's vanity. The entire ballroom erupted. The wealthy elite do not tolerate being treated like fools. They absolutely do not tolerate being unknowingly tied to federal racketeering and international money laundering. Politicians realized their careers were entirely jeopardized by their presence at this gala. Billionaire investors realized they were actively being robbed by a slick, fast-talking fraudster in a custom tuxedo. The polite, high society atmosphere completely vanished. It was instantly replaced by a vicious, terrifying corporate rage. A powerful hedge fund manager stood up violently, throwing his champagne glass onto the carpet. He pointed directly at Donovan. "You stole from my investment group!" The manager shouted, his face turning purple with fury. Another wealthy real estate tycoon marched toward the stage. "You slick, lying thief!" the tycoon roared, his fists clenched tight at his sides. "I wrote a $200,000 check tonight. You were sending my capital to a cartel." Donovan backed away from the podium. The smooth, arrogant investment director was gone. He looked like a terrified rat trapped in a brightly lit maze. He looked toward the main doors, searching for an escape route. But the crowd of furious, powerful billionaires was already moving. They surged forward as a collective angry mass. They completely surrounded the base of the stage. They formed a solid, impenetrable wall of expensive suits and absolute fury. Donovan was completely boxed in. There was nowhere left to run. There was no more shadow left to hide his crimes. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a horrifying realization. He had finally understood that I did not just defeat him. I had thrown him directly into a pit of starving wolves. Donovan raised his hands, his palms facing the encroaching wall of furious billionaires. The slick, confident aura he had worn like armor completely evaporated. Sweat poured down his forehead, soaking the collar of his custom-tailored tuxedo. He backed up against the edge of the mahogany stage, his eyes darting frantically around the crowded ballroom. "Listen to me," Donovan shouted, his voice cracking with sheer desperation. "You are all looking at fabricated data. I am a victim of corporate sabotage. I did not authorize those offshore transfers. My lower-level accounting team handled the philanthropic routing. I had rogue regional managers moving that capital behind my back. This vindictive woman hacked our servers to frame me because she was cut out of the family will. You know me. You know my reputation. I would never betray your trust." The wealthy donors did not retreat a single inch. A high-profile tech investor slammed his fist onto a nearby dining table, rattling the crystal centerpieces and spilling expensive wine across the white linen cloth. "Do not treat us like absolute idiots," the investor roared. "Your digital signature is on every single integration loop she just projected on that screen. You used our clean money to finance your cartel debts." Madison broke through the edge of the angry crowd. Her massive silver gown caught on the dining chairs, tearing the expensive fabric, but she did not care. The reality of the situation had finally pierced through her thick, arrogant skull. She was not looking at a mere family argument anymore. She was looking at the complete, undeniable destruction of her entire existence. She scrambled up the short stairs of the stage and threw herself at Donovan. She grabbed the lapels of his soaked tuxedo jacket, her manicured nails digging deep into the expensive fabric. Her face was a horrifying mess of smeared mascara and running foundation. "Donovan, tell them it is a lie," Madison shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly through the massive ballroom. "Fix this right now. Tell them my sister is crazy. You promised me we were untouchable. You promised me the Harrison Group was mine. Do something. Call your security guards and have these people thrown out. Call the police." As if answering her frantic demand, the towering double doors of the grand ballroom burst open with deafening force. It was not the local police. It was a highly coordinated, massive federal raid. Over 24 heavily armed agents flooded into the opulent room. They wore tactical vests emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, flanked by suited officers from the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Their heavy boots slammed against the plush imported carpets. The elite guests immediately stepped back, parting like a fractured sea to let the federal authorities pass. The agents moved with terrifying, absolute precision, entirely ignoring the screaming billionaires and the shattered champagne glasses scattered across the floor. The lead federal agent marched directly down the center aisle, his eyes locked onto the stage. He unclipped a heavy leather folder from his belt and held it up high for the entire room to see. "Donovan, you are under arrest," the lead agent announced, his voice booming with unquestionable authority. "We have secured a federal warrant for massive wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and international money laundering under the Racketeer, Influenced, and Corrupt Organizations Act. Put your hands behind your back immediately." Donovan froze completely. The color drained entirely from his dark skin, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. He looked at the federal agents swarming the base of the stage. He looked at the angry mob of elite investors ready to tear him apart. Finally, he looked up at me standing securely behind the podium. I simply stared back at him, my expression completely blank, watching the very last second of his freedom slip away. 2 federal agents ascended the stairs. They grabbed Donovan by his broad shoulders and spun him around violently. They kicked his legs apart and slammed his chest against the polished wood of the podium. The sharp metallic clicking sound of the heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists echoed through the dead-silent ballroom. Madison stood frozen in absolute terror, her hands covering her mouth. She watched the federal agents pat down her glamorous husband, stripping away his phone, his wallet, and the extorted transfer document he had kept hidden in his pocket. Donovan felt the cold steel bite into his wrists. He realized in that exact fraction of a second that his life was completely over. He was facing decades in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The cartel would likely hunt him down the second he stepped inside a cell. His arrogant, manipulative brain shifted into ultimate survival mode. A cornered rat will always chew off its own leg to escape a deadly trap. Donovan decided to chew off his wife instead. He violently twisted his head around, fighting against the grip of the federal agents holding him down. He locked his furious, bloodshot eyes onto Madison. "She is the primary signatory!" Donovan screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice echoing across the shocked ballroom. "Do not just arrest me. Arrest her too. She is the chief executive officer of the shell companies. Her name is on the incorporation documents for the offshore accounts. She signed every single illegal check to fund her disgusting shopping addiction. She knew exactly where the money was coming from. Madison is a full, willing accomplice." Madison recoiled as if she had just been shot directly in the chest. Her eyes widened in pure, unadulterated horror. The flawless romantic illusion of her high society marriage instantly shattered into a million jagged pieces. "You lying, treacherous coward," Madison shrieked, launching herself at him like a feral animal. "You told me those were standard tax documents. You told me I was just signing routine corporate expense reports. You ruined my life. You stole my father's company, and you completely ruined my life." She swung her fists wildly, slapping and clawing at his face before the federal agents physically restrained her, dragging her violently backward. Her expensive silver gown ripped loudly against the floorboards as she kicked and thrashed. "You greedy, brainless parasite!" Donovan roared back, spitting the words with absolute venom as the agents hauled him toward the stairs. "You spent $50,000 a week on designer garbage while I was risking my life to keep the cartel from slicing our throats. You love the money. You love the yacht. Do not play the innocent victim now. You are going to rot in a federal cell right next to me." I stood perfectly still behind the podium, my hands resting lightly on the polished wood. I watched the two of them tear each other to shreds, screaming vile, disgusting insults at one another right in front of the most powerful people in the state. The perfect golden couple had devolved into two rabid animals fighting in a cage. Their fake love, their arrogant pride, and their stolen empire had all burned to the ground in less than 20 minutes. The morning sun rose over the sprawling Harrison family estate, casting long and peaceful shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn. The sky was a brilliant and cloudless blue, providing a stark contrast to the violent storm that had soaked my clothes just a few nights prior. The massive iron gates stood tall and imposing, originally designed to keep the rest of the world out. But those gates no longer belonged to the people sleeping inside. At exactly 8 in the morning, a heavy convoy of law enforcement vehicles turned onto the private drive. 3 black and white county sheriff cruisers led the way, their light bars flashing bright blue and red in the quiet suburban neighborhood. Directly behind them was a sleek and unmarked black town car. I sat in the back seat wearing a crisp charcoal suit, holding a sealed manila folder resting on my lap. Today was not about revenge or anger. It was a simple, legally binding debt collection. The convoy halted right in front of the grand marble portico. 4 uniformed deputies stepped out of their cruisers and adjusted their tactical belts. 2 men in plain clothes holding heavy clipboards followed closely behind them. They were the court-appointed asset liquidators. I stepped out of my town car and handed the sealed folder directly to the lead deputy. He broke the seal and briefly reviewed the emergency foreclosure and immediate eviction orders signed by a federal judge at dawn. The documentation authorized Silverwood, LLC, to seize the entire property and all high-value assets inside to satisfy the $40 million defaulted commercial loan. The deputy nodded at me, turned on his heel, and marched straight up the marble steps. He did not gently press the doorbell. He pounded his heavy fist violently against the thick oak doors, the loud and aggressive thuds echoing through the quiet morning air. It took nearly 2 minutes for the door to open. Catherine stood in the entryway wearing a wrinkled silk robe. Her face was incredibly pale and heavily lined with absolute exhaustion. She had barely survived the total humiliation of the charity gala the night before, returning home without her son-in-law who was currently sitting in a federal holding cell. When she saw the uniformed officers and the flashing police lights in her driveway, her eyes widened in sheer terror. Behind her, Madison stumbled out of the living room. She was still wearing last night's ruined silver gown, her hair a tangled and chaotic mess. The lead deputy stepped forward and held the court order high so they could clearly read the bold black print. By order of the state court, this property has been officially foreclosed and seized by the primary creditor, the deputy announced loudly. You have exactly 30 minutes to vacate the premises. You are permitted to take only basic clothing and essential personal hygiene items. Everything else inside this structure is now the legal property of Silverwood LLC. Madison let out a piercing and hysterical shriek. She practically shoved her mother aside and charged at the deputy. "You cannot do this!" Madison screamed, her voice cracking wildly. "This is my house. My father left this house to me. You have no right to come here and tell me to leave." The deputy remained completely unmoved and simply crossed his arms over his chest. "Your corporation defaulted on a $40 million loan," the deputy stated firmly. "The deed to this estate was the collateral. Your 30 minutes started right now. I highly suggest you go pack." Madison spun around and finally noticed me standing at the bottom of the marble stairs. Her face twisted with a toxic mixture of hatred and absolute panic. She turned and sprinted wildly up the grand spiral staircase, her torn silver gown trailing behind her. She ran straight into her massive walk-in closet and frantically pulled down her designer luggage. She began throwing everything she could grab into the bags. Diamond necklaces, imported silk dresses, and stacks of limited edition designer handbags. She was desperately trying to hoard millions of dollars of luxury goods that had been purchased with the stolen corporate cash Donovan had laundered. The two plainclothes asset liquidators followed her right up the stairs, flanked by a sheriff deputy. They stepped into the massive closet and firmly placed their hands on her half-packed suitcases. "Step away from the bags," the lead liquidator instructed coldly. "Financial records prove these luxury items were purchased using embezzled corporate funds. They are legally classified as stolen assets and will be auctioned to satisfy the corporate debt. You cannot take them." Madison fought like a feral animal. She grabbed a bright red crocodile skin handbag and clutched it fiercely to her chest, kicking and screaming at the men. "Get your filthy hands off my things!" Madison roared, heavy tears streaming down her ruined face. "My husband bought these for me. They are mine." The deputy easily overpowered her, prying the expensive handbag from her desperate grip and tossing it onto the floor. He pointed toward the stairs, ordering her to leave the room immediately with only the clothes on her back. Exactly 30 minutes later, the deputies escorted my mother and sister out the front doors. They were not carrying matched sets of luxury designer luggage. They were carrying flimsy black garbage bags filled with basic sweatpants and old cotton shirts. The liquidators had stripped them of every single gold watch, every piece of jewelry, and every electronic device that was not strictly essential for survival. They were escorted down the marble steps, forced to walk the exact same path they had made me walk just a few nights ago. Madison was sobbing uncontrollably. Her chest heaved as she stumbled down the driveway, clutching her plastic garbage bag like a lifeline. She looked like a broken and hollow shell of the arrogant influencer she had pretended to be. Catherine walked beside her, her legs visibly shaking with every single step. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, Catherine stopped right in front of me. She looked at the flashing police lights, the cold faces of the liquidators, and the grand mansion she was never going to enter again. Her aristocratic pride completely shattered in an instant. Catherine collapsed onto her knees, right there on the damp morning grass, landing on the exact same spot where she had thrown my suitcase. She dropped her garbage bag and clasped her hands together, staring up at me with a face entirely drenched in desperate and humiliating tears. "Please, Sloane." Catherine wailed, her voice a pathetic and trembling beg for mercy. "I am your mother. You cannot just throw us out onto the street. We have absolutely nowhere to go. Please show us some mercy. I am begging you. Catherine was on the damp morning grass, her knees soaking through her thin silk robe. The cold dew seeped into the expensive fabric, grounding her in a harsh, unforgiving reality. The absolute desperation in her eyes was something I had never witnessed in my entire 33 years of existence. This was a woman who had spent decades meticulously crafting an image of untouchable high society perfection. She had ruthlessly judged everyone around her based on their bank accounts, their zip codes, and their designer labels. Now she was kneeling in the dirt, clutching a cheap plastic garbage bag, surrounded by flashing police lights and stern-faced asset liquidators. The sheriff deputies watched her with professional clinical detachment. They had executed hundreds of corporate evictions and possessed zero tolerance for theatrical delays. Madison stood a few feet away, entirely paralyzed by the shock of her new reality. Her ruined silver gown dragged heavily in the mud, the expensive fabric permanently stained. She clutched her own black garbage bag tightly against her chest, looking like a discarded extra from a terrible reality television show. She did not even attempt to help our mother off the ground. She just stared blankly at the massive iron gates, finally comprehending that she had absolutely nowhere to go. Donovan was sitting in a federal holding cell facing decades of prison time, and her $36 million fantasy was completely dead and buried. Suddenly, Catherine scrambled forward on her hands and knees. She ignored the warning glance from the nearby sheriff deputy and lunged directly toward me. Her manicured hands, now entirely devoid of the expensive diamond rings the liquidators had just confiscated, desperately grabbed the pristine fabric of my charcoal suit sleeve. Her grip was tight and frantic, like a drowning sailor clinging to a piece of floating driftwood in a violent storm. "Sloane, please!" Catherine wailed, her voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical pitch that echoed across the manicured lawn. "You cannot do this to your own flesh and blood. I am your mother. I gave birth to you. I carried you for 9 months. You cannot just erase me from your life and throw me out into the street. We are a family. Blood is thicker than water." Tears streamed rapidly down her face, ruining what little makeup she had left, leaving dark, messy streaks across her pale cheeks. "I will do anything, Sloane." Catherine begged, her voice dropping into a pathetic, suffocated sob. "I will sign whatever legal papers you want. I will publicly apologize to you on television. Just let me stay on the estate. I do not need the master suite. I do not need the luxury cars or the country club memberships. I will live in the basement. I will stay in the gardener's shed out back. I can cook your meals. I can scrub the marble floors on my hands and knees. Just please do not leave me out here with absolutely nothing. Your father would never want to see his wife treated like a stray dog." I stood completely rigid. I did not step back. I did not try to pull my arm away. I just looked down at the trembling, broken woman clutching my sleeve. As a forensic accountant, I was highly trained to detect fraudulent behavior. I spent my entire career separating genuine data from fabricated numbers. Looking at my mother right now, I saw the exact same manipulation tactics Donovan had used to steal millions. She was not apologizing because she felt genuine remorse for throwing me out into the freezing rain. She was not crying because she suddenly realized she had been a toxic, abusive parent who favored my sister at every turn. She was crying because her unlimited credit cards were declined. She was weaponizing the concept of family solely because she had completely run out of financial leverage. She was attempting an emotional, hostile takeover, and I was firmly denying the merger. I looked directly into her tear-filled eyes. My expression remained entirely blank and utterly devoid of human sympathy. "Blood only matters to you when you need a human shield, Catherine," I stated, my voice echoing coldly in the crisp morning air. "You did not care about flesh and blood when you laughed at me in the lawyer's office. You did not care about family when you watched Donovan mock my career. You were perfectly happy to throw your eldest daughter out into a violent storm just to protect your fake, glittering social status. You made your choice with absolute clarity. I slowly and deliberately reached down with my right hand. I firmly peeled her trembling fingers off the fabric of my suit, breaking her desperate grip one finger at a time. Catherine let out a pathetic, gasping breath, realizing her emotional manipulation was completely failing. I reached into the inner breast pocket of my tailored jacket. My fingers brushed against a small, folded piece of paper. I pulled it out and held it up between my index and middle finger. It was a single $100 bill. It was heavily crinkled, slightly stiff, from having been soaked in freezing rain and dried over a hotel radiator. It was the exact same bill she had crumpled into a ball and thrown at my chest just a few nights prior. Catherine stared at the green paper. Her breath hitched in her throat. The memory of her own sheer cruelty suddenly flashed across her exhausted face. She realized in that exact fraction of a second that every single action she had taken against me had finally come full circle. The universe had just handed her a perfectly balanced, undeniable receipt for her abuse. I leaned down slightly, bringing my face level with hers. I forcefully pressed the crumpled $100 bill directly into the palm of her shaking hand and closed her fingers tightly around it. "Take it and call an Uber," I commanded, echoing the exact vicious words she had used to discard me. "You are 58 years old, Catherine. It is time you stop relying on me. I have a massive corporate empire to run now, and the board of directors is watching closely. Failures should not burden this family." I did not wait for a response. I did not look at Madison. I turned my back on them both, squaring my shoulders, and began walking up the grand marble staircase of my estate. The sheriff deputies immediately stepped forward, physically guiding my mother and sister away from the portico and toward the main gates. I reached the top of the stairs, stepped through the heavy oak doors, and walked into the warm, quiet foyer. Behind me, the massive wooden doors slammed completely shut, the heavy deadbolt clicking loudly into place, locking them out of my life forever. 6 months had passed since the heavy oak doors of the family estate slammed shut behind me. The bitter freezing rain of that night felt like an entire lifetime ago. I was currently sitting in the sprawling glass-walled executive suite on the top floor of the newly rebranded Silverwood Enterprises skyscraper. The morning sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the pristine, minimalist decor of my personal office. I wore a sharp, custom-tailored navy blue suit that projected absolute, unquestionable authority. I reached across my polished marble desk and picked up a small porcelain cup. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my perfectly brewed espresso. The dark, bitter liquid grounded me in the quiet, undisturbed peace of my empire. I turned my attention to the massive, ultra-wide monitors dominating my workspace. The screens were no longer filled with the chaotic red routing numbers of illicit offshore gambling syndicates or desperate toxic debt covenants. They were completely saturated with vibrant, glowing green data points. The financial health of Silverwood Enterprises was immaculate. Revenue was up 40% across all legitimate sectors, and my aggressive corporate restructuring had fortified the company against any future instability. A sleek flat-screen television hung seamlessly on the far wall of my office, quietly broadcasting the morning financial news network. The breaking news ticker flashing across the bottom of the screen caught my attention. I unmuted the audio with a simple click of a remote. The news anchor was delivering the final devastating update on a high-profile corporate fraud and racketeering trial. The camera cut to a live shot outside the federal courthouse. Donovan was being escorted down the concrete steps by two heavily armed federal marshals. The arrogant, slick investment director who used to wear custom Italian suits and boast about buying $2 million luxury yachts was completely gone. He was wearing a shapeless, bright orange prison jumpsuit. His hands and ankles were bound by heavy steel chains that clanked loudly against the pavement. He looked hollowed out, utterly defeated, and visibly terrified of his new reality. The anchor confirmed the judge's ruling. Donovan was sentenced to a mandatory 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the slightest possibility of early parole. He had attempted to use his slick charm to negotiate a reduced sentence by turning on his cartel associates, but the federal prosecutors did not need his testimony. My encrypted hard drive had provided every single piece of undeniable forensic evidence they required. Now Donovan was heading to a concrete cell where he would spend the next decade and a half looking over his shoulder, constantly terrified of the violent syndicate he had foolishly betrayed. I muted the television again, feeling absolutely zero sympathy for the man in the orange jumpsuit. My thoughts briefly drifted to Madison, the glamorous influencer who had laughed in my face and tried to physically throw my luggage into the mud, had experienced a spectacular, unavoidable crash. The bankruptcy courts had shown her zero mercy. They liquidated every single designer handbag, every piece of diamond jewelry, and every pair of expensive shoes she owned to satisfy a tiny fraction of the massive corporate debt she had blindly signed her name to. Her verified social media accounts, once filled with millions of envious followers and luxurious vacation photos, had been permanently deleted to avoid the relentless flood of public mockery. I had seen a recent report from the private investigator I kept on retainer just to monitor loose ends. Madison was currently working the late shift at a greasy, high-volume fast food franchise on the outskirts of the city. The girl who once demanded premium beluga caviar and vintage champagne was now wearing a poorly fitted stain-covered polyester uniform. She spent her evenings standing under harsh fluorescent lights, handing cheap paper bags of French fries to impatient drivers through a drive-through window. She was completely anonymous, entirely broke, and absolutely miserable. And then there was Catherine. The aristocratic matriarch who had valued her country club membership above her own eldest daughter was living a life she once considered worse than death. The $100 bill I had pressed into her trembling hand was likely spent on the very first taxi ride away from the estate. With her husband dead, her golden child bankrupt, and her son-in-law in federal prison, her wealthy social circle had abandoned her instantly. The elite friends she had spent decades trying to impress treated her like a contagious disease. She was currently living in a cramped, decaying, subsidized social housing complex on the wrong side of the tracks. The woman who used to complain if the valet parked her luxury sedan too far away was now forced to carry her cheap groceries onto a crowded public city bus. She had nothing left but the agonizing memories of the empire she had gleefully helped destroy. I set my empty espresso cup down onto the marble desk. I looked at the glowing green financial reports one more time. My pulse was incredibly steady. My heart was entirely calm. I did not shed a single tear for any of them. I did not feel a momentary pang of guilt or a lingering sense of familial loss. The intense, highly orchestrated betrayal they had subjected me to had completely burned away any naive illusions I once held about loyalty. I finally understood the absolute, undeniable truth. Blood does not make a family. Biological ties do not automatically guarantee respect or protection. In the ruthless reality of the corporate world and human nature, blind allegiance to blood only creates dangerous, fatal weaknesses. It creates blind spots that greedy, manipulative parasites will inevitably exploit to bleed you dry. They had assumed my loyalty to the family name would make me a passive, silent victim. They thought throwing me out into the rain would break my spirit and secure their stolen throne. Instead, they had simply handed me the exact tools I needed to sever the dead weight from my life. I had methodically identified every single emotional and financial vulnerability in my existence, and I had surgically removed them all. I stood up from my leather executive chair and walked slowly toward the massive floor-to-ceiling window. I slipped my hands into the pockets of my tailored suit. I looked down at the sprawling, vibrant city stretching out for miles below me. The streets were filled with people scrambling for wealth, power, and survival. I was no longer one of the people scrambling on the ground. I was standing at the absolute peak of the mountain I had built with my own two hands and my own brilliant mind. My eyes were cold, sharp, and completely fearless as I surveyed my flawless, untouchable empire. I was the supreme architect of my own destiny, and I was finally truly invincible. The resounding lesson from this story is that biology does not automatically entitle anyone to your loyalty, your success, or your peace of mind. Society often conditions us to believe that family is an unbreakable bond, demanding unconditional forgiveness and endless sacrifices. However, this narrative shatters that dangerous illusion. When toxic relatives view you not as a loved one, but as a disposable asset or a convenient target for their own insecurities, clinging to the title of family becomes a profound vulnerability. Sloane's survival and ultimate triumph depended entirely on her ability to separate emotional manipulation from cold, hard reality. She realized that allowing abusive people to remain in her life, just because they shared DNA, was a recipe for her own destruction. Furthermore, the story brilliantly underscores the absolute necessity of personal competence and financial independence. Sloane did not rely on luck, wait for a miraculous rescue, or beg for scraps of affection from a mother and sister who despised her. Her salvation was built purely on her own intellect, her relentless work ethic, and her strategic foresight. Her specialized professional skills were her ultimate armor against an arrogant, greedy world. This teaches us that the greatest safety net you can ever build is your own capability. When you are completely self-reliant, you are no longer at the mercy of those who seek to control, exploit, or diminish you. You hold the pen that writes your own future. Ultimately, this is a powerful testament to the necessity of setting ruthless boundaries. It reminds us that true justice and peace arrive when we stop seeking approval from those determined to undervalue us, allowing us to build our own untouchable empires. If this story of reclaiming your power and setting unbreakable boundaries resonated with you, hit the like button, subscribe for more empowering content, and share how you conquered your own toxic situations in the comments below.